Ladies and gentlemen, we will convene the meeting of the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. We have a full agenda that will take us through the afternoon, and I appreciate the members who are here and ready to work. We expect a few others to come momentarily, but we will start. Unless there's objections, I'm going to, at the beginning of the meeting, go out of order and go straight to this tab 2, which is Commission and Staff Update, for the express purpose of the reading of a resolution honoring the life and legacy of Mike Carter. And in a moment, we are going to join Mrs. Carter and the family down here in the well and at the podium. But before we do, let me, if I may, members and ladies and gentlemen, just offer a word in memory of my friend Mike Carter, who I had the privilege to work with in the General Assembly. Mike Carter was an extraordinary legislator because he understood and cared about people, which is really a fundamental prerequisite in serving the public, in my opinion. He had a heart for man. He was a capable lawyer, and his advice was always valuable, but it was undergirded by that care about people. He had a heart for man. And with that, if I could get the director and my vice chairman, we will go down to the well now and ask the gentleman charged with reading it. Yes, and Miss, if we can have the family, we will do that. And then we will, ladies and gentlemen, we will get back to the regular schedule, but we wanted to do this first.
Before I begin, I just want to say what a privilege it is to have this opportunity to read the resolution. A resolution to honor the memory of Chairman Mike Carter of Ooltewah, Tennessee, for meritorious service on the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. Whereas it is appropriate to honor members who have performed their duties with the utmost integrity and whose efforts have ensured proper attention to innumerable issues and fulfillment of the Commission's mission to serve as a forum for the discussion and resolution of intergovernmental problems, to provide high-quality research support to state and local government officials in order to improve the overall quality of government in Tennessee, and to improve the effectiveness of the intergovernmental system to better serve the citizens of Tennessee. Whereas Chairman Carter, a native of Ooltewah, Tennessee, and an alumnus of Middle Tennessee State University and the University of Memphis Law School, practiced law in Memphis before returning to Ooltewah. Whereas, with his wife of 46 years, Joan, he raised two wonderful sons, Stephen and Tim, and was a proud grandfather of Walter. Whereas, Chairman Carter practiced law for 20 years in Chattanooga, representing a wide range of clients, including the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department from 1985 until 1997. Whereas, in 1997, he was appointed by Governor Don Sundquist as judge of the General Sessions Court of Hamilton County, Tennessee. Whereas, in August of 2005, after volunteering to serve in nursing homes in Houston, Texas during Hurricane Rita, Chairman Carter came to the conclusion to resign his judgeship and go into full-time service for those elderly who could not serve themselves. Whereas he served as Special Assistant to Hamilton County Mayor Claude Ramsey from 2009 until 2011. Whereas Chairman Carter served as representative from District 29 in the Tennessee House of Representatives from 2013 until his death, serving as chairman of the Civil Justice Committee and on the Children and Family Affairs Subcommittee, Civil Justice Subcommittee, Local Government Committee, Property and Planning Subcommittee, and Calendar and Rules Committee. Whereas Chairman Carter sponsored several pieces of legislation during his career, but with a mission of enabling Tennessee to lead the nation in matching children with loving families, He was most proud of those bills he sponsored that dealt with adoption. Whereas numerous current and former Tennessee state government leaders noted their high esteem for Chairman Carter and his leadership, among them Governor Bill Lee, who said that he would miss Chairman Carter and that he considered him a leader and a friend, and Speaker Cameron Sexton, who commented on Chairman Carter's career as an effective and dedicated public servant. Whereas Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally said, Judge Carter was an excellent public servant and a great man, and that he provided wise counsel to his colleagues and displayed fierce loyalty to his friends. Former Speaker Beth Harwell remembered him as one of the most sincere and intelligent men I have ever met. Representative Jeremy Faison said, Judge, you were one of the very best minds I ever had the privilege of serving with. Representative Chris Todd called Carter a true statesman as well as a friend and mentor, and TACIR Vice Chairman Mayor Kevin Brooks said, Tennessee is a better state because of Representative Mike Carter. I am a better man for having served alongside him in Nashville. Whereas members of Congress representing Tennessee also stated their respect for Chairman Carter, with U.S. Senators Marsha Blackburn and Bill Hagerty calling him a true statesman and a strong leader, and U.S. Representative Chuck Fleshman saying Mike was an outstanding judge, great state representative, and a tremendous leader in the community. Whereas, in addition to his many other leadership roles, Chairman Carter served with distinction on the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations starting in May 2013, being elected chairman 6 years later at the 2019 meeting, and as its chairman, providing leadership and direction to the commission's staff. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations that we hereby honor the memory of Chairman Mike Carter, reflecting on his valuable contributions to the Tennessee Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations and for his honorable and dedicated service to the good people of Hamilton County, House District 29, and this great state. Be it further resolved that we express our sympathy and offer our most heartfelt condolences to the family of Chairman Mike Carter.
I see Chairman Watson from Chattanooga has come in. If there's no objection, could we have Chairman Watson join us for a picture? Yes. Chairman Hazelwood, thank you. I didn't see you. Here's a framed original to this resolution that we just read, and please take it with our best wishes and our inestimable high opinion of your late husband for the outstanding work he did to help people.
This is such an honor. Thank you.
We need to look up here.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
Good, yeah.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
See you, Bill. I like the beard. What there is of it. Thank you so much. Well, thank you very much. Barely knew you. Thank you, guys.
I'm advised that we need to take one more picture of one of our staff members for an award they've received. It'll just take one moment. All right, if now we will, thank you very much for your indulgence, ladies and gentlemen. And we will now go, I will direct your attention to tab 1, the minutes of the June 2021 meeting. Chair to entertain a motion that was there a second? Then properly moved and seconded. Any questions? There being none, we'll take it on a voice vote. Those in favor of receiving, say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Carries. I direct your attention now, members and ladies and gentlemen, to tab 2, Commission and Staff Update, and I will defer to Dr. Lippert, our Executive Director. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The second item on our under tab 2 in commission updates is a notification that Assistant Commissioner Sammy Arnold, who's been a member of TACIR for a couple of years now and a very active member, rolled off of the commission at the end of August because he's left his position with the Department of Economic and Community Development to begin a new position as Chief of Staff for Speaker of the House of Representatives Cameron Sexton. So I think we'll be seeing Sammy again, but not on this side of the podium. So if you could please join me in thanking Sammy for his service on the commission and congratulating him on his new position. And we do have a certificate of appreciation that we will be mailing to Sammy. So. And then we have a couple of staff updates. First of all, we have 3 new staff members. You'll recall at our last meeting, we had some people who were moving on to new opportunities, and we have 3 new staff people who are going to be stepping in and taking their place on the team. We have Chris Belden, Presley Powers, and Michael Strickland. They've all joined our staff since our last meeting. If I could ask the 3 of you to stand, please. Chris holds a Master's of Arts in Economics from the University of Alabama. Presley has a Master's of Sociology from Middle Tennessee State University, and Michael holds both a Master of Arts and a PhD in Anthropology from the University of California at Los Angeles. So once again, please join me in welcoming Chris, Presley, and Michael, and welcome to the team. And then one last staff update. Mr. Chairman, Research Manager Jennifer Berry has completed a graduate certificate in public policy at Tennessee State University's College of Public Service. This is in addition to the master's degree she already had, so we really believe strongly in continuing education. And if you could join me in congratulating Jennifer on this accomplishment, please. Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, that concludes the staff and commission updates.
Thank you, Director Lippert. And now I will call your attention to tab 3, House Bill 366, Senate Bill 1604, relative to right-of-way dedications. I believe that we have a panel discussion on the subject. As you know, the TACIR was asked to study the bill that had been filed, I believe, by Senator Bailey and Representative Williams that would prohibit a governmental entity from requiring a landowner to transfer ownership of any part of his or her property located along an existing public right-of-way as a condition of approving any application made to the entity to develop the property. And the bill would authorize the governmental entity to require a right-of-way reservation as a condition of approving any proposed subdivision of the property. But if a government entity takes possession of the property, then the owner must be entitled to just compensation. That bill, as I just said, was forwarded to us for study and recommendation, and I will now, Mr. Director, defer to Bill Terry, the Senior Research Consultant, who will introduce the panel.
First off, a couple of comments. I have to disclose something for the whole commission here first. That is the fact that I am a registered lobbyist for the Tennessee chapter of the American Planning Association. And that could be a conflict, but I in my work, continue to keep the two jobs completely separate. And I advised the TAPA Executive Committee when this bill came up that I could no longer represent them on this bill, that I had to be totally objective. So that's that statement. Second, just to highlight the
Representative Williams. Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate you coming today. As the legislative lobbyist for the Tennessee Planners Association, while you were lobbying against this bill for the last several years, how do you bifurcate how you do TACIR research and how you're able to still represent the planners across the state? I'd like to know. I'd like to get a better understanding of that. I appreciate you announcing that here today. I just do think if you're the person in charge of the study here, I think if it's my understanding the Planning Commission Association across the state has been vehemently opposed to this bill over the last 3 times. And so maybe if you could help me better understand that, I would appreciate it.
I just simply do not participate in anything on this bill that the planners are for. I told them I couldn't do it.
Director Lickford.
And I would like to make clear that Bill is a research consultant with the Tennessee Advisory Commission, has been for several years now, and I do respect the objectivity he's shown over the course of his service. He's the consultant on this project. He's not the lead person on this project. And we, as with all of our projects, have a team working on it to include our senior research director is the research director for this project. We have another research associate working on it. And once we conclude some of the other work that is in progress now, one of our research managers will also be moving to the project. We rely on Bill primarily for his technical expertise on the subject matter. So while he will certainly be able to provide us technical information and his own expertise on it, our study goes well beyond Bill's participation. Mr. Chairman.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate that. I think it's very appropriate of him to state his known conflict. I appreciate that as a member, one of the newest members to this committee. I think the last time you met it was not in this format or didn't have information before you. So I look forward to seeing how the process works and going forward, and I look forward to see his objectivity as it relates to the communication of it. I would be remiss if I did not say that based upon what I've seen thus far over the last several years, but I stand to be corrected if that's the case. Thank you.
Anything
Mr.
else for me? I did want to explain the subdivision process just very quickly. Some people don't understand it. In approving new developments, there's a 2-step process in most cases. Submission of a preliminary plat to the Planning Commission and approval, and submission of a final plat, which is different from the preliminary, but it's more detailed. There's also in between that a submission of construction and engineering plans that are approved generally by staff. So the point where this comes into play generally is at the submission of the final plat, where rights of way are then dedicated. And there are 2 types of rights of way. There's the one we're talking about here on existing county roads, and then there's the rights of way on a new construction of a road. And it's my understanding that this bill does not affect the new construction dedications. So at this point, I'll introduce the panel. First, we have Ms. Sandra Knight. She is the current president of the Tennessee County Highway Officials Association, and she's representing them today. Have a seat anywhere. Mr. Kevin Rigsby. He's the town planner for the town of Smyrna. Mr. Benjamin Mormon, Legislative Chair of Tennessee Association of Professional Surveyors, and Charles Schneider, Mr. Charles Schneider, who is Executive Director of the Tennessee Home Builders Association. With that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the work of each member of the panel. Look forward to hearing what they have to say. I think this has already been discussed, but we do have a panel discussion, another discussion to follow this one, and we're anxious to hear what you have to say. We would encourage you, if you can, to keep it within 10 to 15 minutes, your remarks, because I'm sure members will have questions as well. So let's see. Is there a preference of how we start? Charlie, you want to start?
I would love to go last, just because we were neutral on this bill, and just going to have to give our general opinion.
All right. Who would like? I'll ask for from Bradley County. Thank you. Yes, you do. If you look there at the base, when the red light comes on.
Okay. Is it on now?
Yes, ma'am. And just speak into it.
Like you said, I am with Bradley County. I served as the county engineer for 18 years and now the road superintendent for another 7 years. So as county engineer, was actually over the planning department and worked closely with them. And I agree with Mr. Terry as far as there are several steps in the planning, but once the 2 planning steps are done, then there's a third step where the new road that is built or any access off of an existing county road actually comes to the road superintendent for signature. Once the road is built as far as a new subdivision, it's not required that it be taken in for county maintenance purposes. Most developers do want it taken in because they want the county to be responsible for it. And that's kind of one of the trade-offs between the extra right-of-way that's dedicated and the maintenance of the future maintenance of the road, because the county is responsible for it from now on. And I think a lot of things we've discussed between several of my colleagues was that these need to be remaining at the local level, because just like some of the reports you've gotten, this county does it this way, this county does it that way. Each county should be responsible for their own restrictions and their own guidance. I know in Bradley County, if you had asked us 5 years ago, how much of the right-of-way have you used for these widening projects, we would have probably told you not much. But as Mr. Brooks knows, in the last few years, you know, we've had Amazon, we've had Valker, we've got a whole new industrial park, Whirlpool expanded. So there's a lot of instances where we have used it recently. So I don't think it's good to make a blanket restriction for a government overreach, unfunded mandates. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. You're telling the rest of the county, we want you to spend your money to pay for this developer over here because they didn't want to dedicate the extra right-of-way. I know it's talked about that, yes, you'll get tax revenue on it, but for most people, even when they call the road department and say, I pay my taxes, I say, well, let me give you your $30 back because it's not even going to buy me a ton of asphalt. So the tax revenue and then turn around and having to purchase right-of-way back in the future is not comparing apples to apples. It's going to be much more cost-effective to have the right-of-way dedicated at the beginning. And it's also a benefit to the property owners. I know we've had several property owners that it mainly deals with family property, and they've broken out 2 or 3 different properties. But when they dedicate that extra right-of-way, I don't know if you're familiar with the highway law, but in TCA 54-7, the county highway department can only work on property that is officially dedicated and accepted by the county. So a lot of our county right-of-ways may have a 36-foot right-of-way. That means that, you know, from the center, you go out half that distance, 18 feet. Most of your ditch lines are not in that 18 feet. So when they dedicate that extra up to the 25 feet, it actually includes their ditch lines, their driveway tiles, and things like that. And we're able to service these people. They're getting a service for the extra property that was dedicated. That's just kind of my comments for now. I don't want to hog it all, so I'm going to pass it on.
Do we have any questions for the presenter before we move on? Representative Williams.
So you said 5 years ago that you didn't use this property. So what you're saying is that the properties that were replatted 10 years ago, that the local government required in the platting process, this additional right-of-way, what you're saying is up until about 5 years ago, all the properties that were extra right-of-way were requested by the local communities, you simply weren't using them in most cases.
In most cases, there were several cases we did. We've seen a huge influx in the last 5 years, but we were using some before that also.
Okay, but it's fair to say, based upon your testimony, that in most cases prior to 5 years, all the right-of-way that was required for county highways or city roads or collector roads was not being utilized by the local government, either because it was not necessary to be used or because a prospective road project that you thought was going to happen in Bradley County simply hadn't happened yet.
I guess that goes to what's your definition of utilization. Just like I said, the ditches, your driveway tiles, people's access to your roads, things like that. That part was utilized. As far as widening the road, probably no.
Other questions for the presenter?
Mr. Chairman, Commission members, Dr. Liberty and staff, I sincerely appreciate the opportunity to present the municipal perspective. I'm sorry. Is it on? Okay. To present the municipal perspective on an issue that is very important to numerous municipalities across the state, including my own town. My name is Kevin Rigsby. I am the town planner in Smyrna, Tennessee, about 20 miles or so southeast of here. I've been a professional planner for over 26 years and have worked for the town of Smyrna for almost 22 years. In that time, I've reviewed countless subdivision plats and various development plans, and the requirement of the dedication of right-of-way has been a part of many of those plans, not all necessarily, but many of them. I tend to use my allotted time to provide a brief overview of the purpose, use, and benefits of right-of-way dedications, and while I am a planner and will offer my own thoughts and perspectives, based on my experience, I'm also here on behalf of the Tennessee Municipal League and other municipalities. TML has conducted research and spoken with city officials and staff, and I have incorporated that research and findings into my remarks where appropriate. And lastly, I will address the position of TML and cities on SB 1604 and offer my personal perspective based on my professional experience and observation. Tennessee law provides local government authority to adopt regulations governing the subdivision of land within its jurisdiction under TCA 134303. By law, such regulation must provide for the coordination of streets within a new development and existing or planned streets in order to ensure the adequate distribution of population and traffic and the creation of conditions favorable to health, safety, and welfare. One way in which such authority is manifested in subdivision regulations is through the requirement of right-of-way dedication. Right-of-way dedications have been in practice here in Tennessee and elsewhere for decades. The Municipal League reports that requiring right-of-way dedications continues to be a common practice utilized by municipalities of all sizes across the state to address public safety issues. While dedications certainly do occur in greater number and faster growing communities like mine in Smyrna, they still occur and maybe less frequently in other communities. The use of dedications in association with individual developments in areas with less development is still common. TML has found that the land associated with these dedications is primarily used to widen and or improve an existing street to increase its capacity to handle added traffic for turn or deceleration lanes or to accommodate such changes that may be associated with planned streets identified in a major thoroughfare plan. At times, these dedications are also used to accommodate improvements to or for the installation of utilities. However, such work is generally conducted in conjunction with measures to increase capacity and safety, not just for utilities. Right-of-way dedications serve a legitimate public interest and benefit both the developer and the municipal taxpayer. While the actual improvements associated with development are funded with tax dollars, the dedication of the portion of land required for such improvements relieves taxpayers from the financial burden of acquiring that portion of the property. Simply put, dedications are a tool that promotes a public interest and provides municipal residents and businesses the benefit of avoiding some costs that are directly tied to a development. Although the cost avoided as a result of any single dedication is limited, the cumulative effect of all such dedications within a given municipality and within municipalities collectively is quite significant. As such, the continued ability of a city or town to utilize right-of-way dedications to limit taxpayers' exposure is central to the consideration of a proposed development. An effective property owner also derives benefit from required right-of-way dedications. Presumably, the property owner is pursuing the approval of the intended use because the use possesses the potential to provide a financial benefit. And often the viability of the development and its relative profitability is largely dependent upon accessibility to that existing or planned roadway. Absent access to prospective development is far less appealing, and its viability and profitability are substantially weakened. Thus, the maximum benefit to the property owner lies not solely in the approval of the proposed use, but rather in the combination of the approval and the completion of any taxpayer-funded modifications that may be required to ensure safe and efficient access. An outcome that is substantially more likely if the ability of local government to limit taxpayers' financial exposure via dedications is preserved. With that background established, I will turn my attention to the Commission's task. SB 1604 would adversely affect many cities and towns and municipal taxpayers. Accordingly, TML and its member cities oppose this legislation for three principal reasons. First, the bill is contrary to long-established practices and would impair a local government's ability to fully exercise authority extended under TCA 134303 in a consistent and equitable fashion. Second, while it is possible for an isolated dedication to be inconsistent with constitutional standards, this bill is based on the premise that any right-of-way dedication required by local government is tantamount to a governmental taking and violates the 14th Amendment. This premise is substantively flawed, as I am informed that the United States Supreme Court held in Dolan versus City of Tigard that when a requirement for a right-of-way dedication is in response to an identifiable impact in which a governmental entity has a legitimate public interest and the dedication provides a solution that is both related to and proportional to the anticipated impact, then such dedications are constitutional. And since I am on the subject of constitutionality, I would like to comment on the proponents of SB 1604 use of Phillips versus Montgomery County before discussing the third reason for opposing the legislation. It is my understanding that in Phillips versus Montgomery County, the facts and circumstances of the underlying case did not include the requirement for a right-of-way dedication. Moreover, the Tennessee Supreme Court made no findings with regard to the merits or circumstances of the underlying case. Instead, the court's ruling was limited to the treatment of governmental takings under the Tennessee Constitution. Therefore, unlike the United States Supreme Court case, which I cited, Phillips versus Montgomery County has no direct correlation with or relationship to the constitutionality of right-of-way dedications. The third reason TML and cities oppose the bill is because it would have the effect of transferring from the property owner to the local taxpayers any costs associated with accommodating alterations to existing or planned streets that may be required. While it is understandable that an owner would rather not grant a dedication, such a proposition would only serve to enrich the owner at the expense of the taxpayers. Taxpayers should not be required to pay costs that are necessary to ensure the viability and profitability of the development. Now, obligating taxpayers in such a way, the bill demands that taxpayers subsidize the owner for what is effectively a cost of doing business. Now, I would like to provide my perspective as someone who's worked in local government for the entirety of my career. If this bill becomes law, there would be ramifications to local governments and taxpayers across the state. To illustrate this point, I would like for the Commission to imagine a real-life scenario for my own community in a world which this bill is law. Farmer Brown passes away, and his heirs decide to sell the farm. Developer Smith buys the property and submits to the town of Smyrna for a rezoning to allow for a development of 422 houses and 217 townhouses. This is a real development in Smyrna that's currently under construction. Developer Smith, did change the names to protect the innocent though. Developer Smith is developing along Rock Springs Road, which is identified on the town of Smyrna Major Thoroughfare Plan as a collector requiring 60 feet of right-of-way. The current right-of-way is 50 feet. As a part of the development of this property, the town requires a traffic impact study, which requires widening Rock Springs Road and installing a traffic signal at the intersection of Rock Springs Road and Waldron Road. None of this would change if this bill were to pass, except the town would be required to pay Developer Smith for that 5-foot strip of land required for right-of-way. It would require the taxpayers of Smyrna to, in effect, at least partially subsidize Developer Smith for his development. And I also want to address the reservation portion of the bill. This is just a separate thing. More often than not in Smyrna, when a subdivision occurs, the lots created along the existing street will actually face the internal street and back up to the existing street to limit driveway connections along that major street. The reserved area then would become part of the lot's backyard. If the municipality does not purchase the right-of-way at the time of development, in all likelihood, when it is acquired, there will be additional cost due to, one, the property is only going to get more valuable, and two, damages would have to be paid due to the fact that the homeowner has their children's play set or the shed they bought from a local home improvement store in that reserved area. So we have to pay damages in addition to purchasing the land. So consequently, if this bill passes, it will be my recommendation to my employer that we purchase the right-of-way at the time of the subdivision plat and not wait. Of course, this will result in the immediate loss of the owner's use of the property and would cause city taxpayers to incur an expense that could be avoided with that dedication. Again, we appreciate very much the opportunity to speak and provide the municipal perspective on this issue, and I look forward to your questions.
Sorry, I guess I'm gonna be the only one to ask questions. By the way, done a lot of business in Smyrna. Congratulations, a lot of growth as we've seen over the last 10 years. Pretty amazing. Done a lot of work there. You and I have worked together a couple of times. You may not realize that, but I'm in the construction business in my full-time job. This is my part-time job. The question is, currently in the town of Smyrna, if you have an abandoned right-of-way or abandoned alleyway or streetway, and the two adjoining property owners want to close it, does the town of Smyrna give the property owner that land?
We typically do, yes. What we will typically do is, especially if there's two property owners and it's both sides and it is an abandoned right-of-way, if those property owners come to us, we have given them back the property. Because oftentimes, especially if we had some alleyways in our older part of town, and they don't, not necessarily anything that the town has maintained or has utilized in many years. The owners have maintained them for several years, and so we have done that many times, actually.
So your community, do you think that's the common practice across the state since you're representing TML?
I honestly don't know. I can't speak for the other municipalities or counties, no.
I can speak for my community. They charge you for it. They go out and they do a public information request for an appraisal of the property, not based upon the tax roll of which they generate revenue from, but a private appraiser to do that. And then if the two adjoining property owners agree to purchase from the municipality, their county or city or government, then they can pay for that additional right-of-way with their own expense, even though the property owner before them gave it through the right-of-way take in previous years. So I think it's interesting that when someone buys a piece of property, they have to dedicate the right-of-way at no cost to the municipality, but then in turn, they have to pay to get it back. It's double tax, if you will. You made a reference to the new project that you talked about in Smyrna. Sounds like a great project. I'd love to have one in Putnam County. It'd be great. But the question I had for you is, under the same farming scenario, if Miss Smith, I think that was the name of the landowner, or maybe it was Miss Brown,
Yeah.
Farmer Brown, there you go. Farmer Brown decided to donate or contribute or deed to her 3 grandchildren the same farm in your community, not for multi-purpose development, not for multi-use development, not for residences or homes, but simply to give it to her grandchildren. In the preliminary and final plat process, would Farmer Brown have to give Smyrna that land?
If it were developed in the intense way this is, yes. If it was a 100-acre farm that's divided up into 3 tracts that are over 5 acres, that's not a subdivision, and typically that would not.
It does meet the regulations as a subdivision. So
If it's greater than 5 acres, it does not, sir.
Okay, so if it's less than 5 acres, Farmer Brown's property is less than 5 acres, and she left 4 quarters to her heirs, then she would have to designate right away.
Yes.
Okay, so is there a higher and best use for that land that's different than that developer, which is to subdivide?
I don't think the highest and best use would come into play here. I think that the idea is that when if a development occurs, whether it's the 639 units that we're talking about in my scenario, that is what's actually occurring, or if they divide 2 1-acre lots off of a farm, either way, it's still, under the state law, it is a subdivision, and does have to comply with the subdivision regulations of the municipality or the county that it is located in. And if that existing right-of-way is not adequate per the adopted major thoroughfare plan, which is a big part of this as well, then they would have to dedicate their half of it, only from the center line, whatever is deficient there.
Would you be more amenable to a bill like this if there was a requirement for the local municipality to build a road within a certain period of time, like we do plan of services for the Planning Commission, where they're required to build the road that they planned on doing? For instance, in my home, if where I currently live, I subdivide the property and the community said we need an additional amount of right-of-way and to build and improve a road in front of my home. It's been 11 years, they haven't improved it. My question is, should we not operate like plans and services as it relates to that? If we're going to take the land for the better good from the owner, should we not at least commit the local municipality to make the improvements that they took the land for?
I would not believe so, no, sir, because many times a plan is a long-term plan. And that improvement may be necessary 10 years from now, but it's not necessary today. And so, because it just depends on how, you also have to consider the local community's budget and how they can budget those improvements. So I would not be amenable to that, no, sir.
One final question. So what do you say to the property owner who is Farmer Brown, who subdivides their property for heirs less than 5 acres that I talked about, or actually greater than 5 acres like I talked about, and that right-of-way dedication is taken, and then her neighbor, Farmer Orange, doesn't subdivide her property, but the city and county come through and pay for the right-of-way there? How is that fair to Farmer Brown versus Farmer Orange?
Well, Farmer Brown had the benefit of, they actually divided the property, so they created increased value on their property at the same time as they were requiring the dedication.
I think that's where we differ. I don't see the perceived value variant there. If the current zoning allows for that subdivision and you're not changing the use, I think that's the difference here, because quite frankly, it's not fair to Farmer Brown that we would take their land and then pay Farmer Orange for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I think Mayor Bickers has been patiently waiting for the floor. Mayor, you're recognized, sir.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rigsby. Got a few questions for you, but I guess I'll disclose that as we all walk in this door, as a collection of our experiences that help make up how we view things. You know, I served as a member of the Louisville Planning Commission for several years before becoming mayor in 2010. We've got a city that's grown 79% in population since I took office in 2010. So we've had considerable experience dealing with growth and development and how that needs to be handled for our residents. Make sure I understand, you know, we often have two challenges when we have a large subdivision or resident coming in. One is, do the roads we have getting to the property in question, are they capable of handling the increase in traffic? I take it this bill doesn't impact that at all.
No.
The second is, once you get into the development, what roads and infrastructure needs to be present so that it is a safe development and it can handle the growth in the future. That's what this bill is talking about. Am I correct in that?
I think the internal streets of a development, this would not affect the ability of a community to require, you know, a 50-foot right-of-way for the new street that's being developed. It would only limit the ability to require that dedication along the existing street.
And that would be in the event, and it's determined in the future, that additional widening or additional ditching for stormwater, other things are required, that's already there, and the city or the county doesn't have to purchase that property in the future.
Correct.
So nothing in this bill would prohibit a municipality or a county from saying, as I look at this 200 or 300 lot residential development, we're going to require you to go ahead and build out and provide the right-of-way, even though we may not need it at present.
It wouldn't prohibit you from requiring them to say, make the improvements that are necessary. There's no provision in there that says, even if you require them to make the improvements like we did in the scenario that I presented, there's nothing in there that says, if they provide the improvements, then they have to give you the right-of-way too. Okay. Nothing that I see in the bill, which would mean that we would have to purchase it before they could do the improvement.
And under current law, if there's a reservation of the right-of-way, it's part of the dedication, and the developer, he's not charged for that, he's simply not paid for that as part of the approval of the subdivision plat.
Correct.
Now, if I were presented with the situation that this bill would appear to create, my inclination would be to go ahead and say, just go ahead and build it out, which would put the developer at greater expense than it would be down the road, right? If you tell me I've got to buy it in the future, I would think I'll just go ahead. Look, we got a 200 lot, 300 house development. We know it's going to fill out in the future. Let's just go ahead, developer. You want it approved? Go ahead and develop it to the full extent of the right-of-way. Wouldn't that be the wisest course for me if I'm presented with how to operate should this bill become law?
Sure.
And wouldn't that actually cost the developer more on the front end than if he simply dedicated the right-of-way?
Yes.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Before we move to our next presenter, I think I'll defer to Executive Director Lippert, who wishes to share a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've received a comment from Calvin Clifton, who's one of our private citizen members from Kingsport. He couldn't be here today because of a family emergency, but he's watching the live stream, and he's been paying attention to this project and asked me to share a comment, and I am quoting now. As a former Public Works Director and past president of the Tennessee chapter of the American Public Works Association, I have serious concerns regarding this legislation. While the dedicated right-of-way may not have been used to date for roadway widening or intersection improvements, it is utilized constantly for the provision of stormwater drainage via surface ditches or underground piping. It's also the location for the necessary utilities to serve existing and future development. These include water, wastewater, natural gas, and electric utilities. It's important that these utilities be located within dedicated roadway for their practical operation and future maintenance and or repairs. Additionally, the local government public works agency typically mows and maintains these rights-of-way at the expense of the taxpayers. The developer and or property owners receive immediate benefit from the dedication of these rights-of-way as they receive immediate maintenance and repairs of the shoulders, ditches, and related facilities located there, not to mention the availability for future expansion. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Mr. Benjamin Moorman, who is the Legislative Chair of the Tennessee Association of Professional Surveyors. Mr. Moorman, you're recognized, sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Benjamin Moorman. I am the current Legislative Chair for the Tennessee Association of Professional Surveyors. I'm a two-time past president, and I have a degree in BS degree in land surveying, license in land surveying since 1986, and have been working in the field the entire time. And so I've been through the process. I've seen it work, and I want to share with you what we've seen over the years and our concerns. We're introducing right-of-way dedications and reservations, not one or the other, both. The current process requires dedications but by private property owners to subdivide their property. Legislative efforts to date consist of an individual surveyor coming before the legislative body in 2017, then TAPS took it on in 2020, and again in 2021. They have never been ruled upon. TACIR was originally scheduled in 2020 and COVID hit. We weren't afforded the opportunity to get with you, which what brought us back to the table for legislation in 2021. We're excited to present here this year. It is our understanding that TACIR will aid in presenting factual information to our legislators for their consideration of for the pending legislation. It's important for you to know that TAPS as an association nor land surveyors individually will benefit in any way from this legislation more than the general public if it becomes law. This is simply put property rights legislation. The current practice as it stands today, any subdivision of property, regardless of size, and that's what's important here, 2 lots, 5 lots, or 3 to 600 lots, they require, if it is a subdivision, that right-of-way be dedicated, no matter how small. Requires that the property owner dedicate a portion of their property that lies adjacent to existing roadways to the local municipality per respective planning body's major road plan. Another interesting point here, many times these subdivisions are along state right-of-ways. The state won't accept this dedication. So now we're dedicating property to the municipality along a state roadway. They're never going to use it. Happens all the time. This is not an occasional situation. This is an example of a project in Putnam County. The original property corner being the axle, and imagine the property owner's property line paralleling the roadway out front. They were going to divide into 2 lots, roughly a 200-foot strip of property. Because of the major road plan, they were required to dedicate 15 feet. That's 3,000 square feet. They had to give away to do 2 lots. Look at the utilities on the side of the road that's there. Anybody that works in the construction industry, pretty good chance that road would be widened the other direction to avoid those existing utilities. So many times these dedications are happening in areas where they'll never be used. Sorry. This is an example of approximately 4.4 miles of road in Putnam County. 4.4, most of it, which is red, is an existing 40-foot right-of-way. The development in the area of green, they developed on both sides of the road. At the time that was, the major road plan called for a 50-foot right-of-way. They had to give 5 feet of right-of-way on each side of the road. You go a little north, and the blue section, 0.3 miles. At that time, it had changed to a 60-foot right-of-way. That individual had to give away 10 feet of their property along that one side of the road. Now, this happens all the time. Imagine if that road truly needed to be improved upon. As Representative Williams represented, all those other property owners are going to be compensated for their land. The others gave it away. It's unconstitutional on a national level and a state level. The Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and Article 1, Section 21 of the Tennessee State Constitution. The Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Section 21, that no man's particular services shall be demanded or taken or applied to public use without consent of his representatives or without just compensation being made therefor. That's our constitutional rights. Planning authorities take the position that getting your subdivision of property approved is compensation. Is it really compensation? I'm sorry, but it looks more like extortion to me. Current practice is fiscally irresponsible. Gross land areas over the years have already been and are being taken off the property tax rolls. That property, once it's dedicated, it's gone. Your local governments are no longer getting a return on that property. This tax base is never recovered. while the benefit of the dedicated right-of-ways are rarely used. Another thing of interest here, these right-of-way dedications are per state law that the planning associations define what these right-of-way widths should be. I live in Knox County, and I'll get to that later, but so many times when a roadway truly is improved, the municipality purchases way less than what all the people had to give away. Of Tennessee's 95 counties, approximately 15 can be represented as counties of significant growth. 80 counties rural with minimal growth. The 15 counties of significant growth, only these counties, and not all of them, perform major road improvements that require property acquisitions. These are the only counties that may benefit from the current process. Notice I said may, and the benefit is minimal. Knox County, my county of residence. I've met extensively with the Knox County Director of Engineering and Public Works concerning this proposed legislation, and he represents, being a county that does make property purchases for road widenings, he represents that the current process of dedications is minimally helpful, only about 5%, less than 5%. When he's performing a roadway project that requires right-of-way acquisitions, he's still faced with purchasing over 95% of the properties required. Back to Representative Williams' presentation. So 95% of the property owners are getting compensated, but these 5% that chose to subdivide their property, they're left out in the cold. They don't get any compensation. Should be interesting to note that Mr. Snowden feels we could work together in this, and he's not opposed to our proposed legislation. Blount County, another county of significant growth. My discussions with the highway superintendent of Blount County reveals that he has never purchased right-of-way for roadway improvements. Yet, he's been led to believe that the current process is why he doesn't have to purchase right-of-way. It's simply not true. Refer back to the tax map in the Putnam County Tax Map. That's reflective of all across our state. This is a map that would represent a series of improvements. All these roads that you're seeing that are built with lots coming off of them, those were built by private developers. Those weren't built by municipalities. And they will continue to be with this legislation. This is not impacting that in the least. So it's zero cost to the municipality. You got 80 rural counties. These counties, along with some of the significant growth counties, do well to maintain their existing roadways and never or rarely, in the case of significant growth counties, perform roadway projects that involve right-of-way acquisitions. They simply maintain the roadways within the existing rights-of-way. They might add a foot of pavement to the outside edge of it or something. That's as far as these folks are going to do. The right-of-way's there for that. There's talk about working the ditches and whatnot. Those ditches, if they're maintaining them now, they will be able to continue to maintain them. They only perform right-of-way acquisitions when state and federal grant money is funding the project. Why? Because they have to, because it's to do it within the law. The current practice is unconstitutional. 80 rural counties. I've learned that many of the rural counties' highway departments receive a portion of their operating capital from property tax revenue. I didn't think that was the case because most of the ones I deal with do not. But if that is the case, the current practice of right-of-way dedications is actually cutting into their operating budgets. They're getting less tax revenue. Our proposed legislation simply allows the private property owner to choose between dedicating the property or creating a reservation upon the property, restricting improvements beyond parking areas, no building construction. Property owner chooses dedication, which he can under this legislation. There's no change to the current process. Property owner chooses the reservation process. The property in question will be clearly identified as being reserved for potential future roadway improvements. The improvements within this area will be limited to minimal improvements, thereby ensuring that the cost of acquisition, if needed, is minimal. There's been discussion about a major development and them having He's already dedicating the right-of-way within his subdivision. Why wouldn't he want to, if he's going to have to widen the road and build that infrastructure, why wouldn't he dedicate that right-of-way? He's not looking for the minimal gain that he would get over that acquisition. Concerns with proposed legislation. Opponents to the proposed legislation contend that it will introduce more eminent domain claims involving litigation. We contend that the opposite is true. By our clearly identifying the property as a reservation for future right-of-way, the property owners, current and future, will be placed on notice of same. Therefore, any acquisitions of properties in these areas will be made with full knowledge of potential right-of-way needs. This is an example of how we would handle that. If you look at the up next to Buck Mountain Road, there's a rectangular portion of the property there. That's identified as the right-of-way reservation. So that'll be placed on the plat of record, forever visible for the property, the public to see. We can work with the planners and have a right-of-way reservation area note that clearly defines what could be done within that reservation area and what can't to protect the public. That's the whole point of that. Subdivisions resulting in major developments. Opponents to the proposed legislation contend that said legislation will place a burden on the public sector in the case of major developments. Again, this is simply not true in regards to right-of-way dedications. There's no doubt that major developments place a burden on the public. School systems have to expand. Roadways throughout the community have to be cared for to service this. But as mentioned earlier, if it's currently causing a problem, that developer will have to deal with it. Traffic impact study requirements. All proposed large developments initiate a traffic impact study. We've heard others talk about that today. Should that said study identify a need for infrastructure improvements, the developer is required to perform said infrastructure improvements at their expense to get approval. Typical developer improvements include turn lanes, deceleration lanes, acceleration lanes, traffic lights. Should these improvements require additional right-of-way, the developer would be required to dedicate said right-of-way as a condition of approval of his plans. Proposed legislation is great legislation. It's long overdue. It is a personal property rights legislation, and Tennessee should set the example for other states to follow yet again. It is simply put legislation that will benefit both the public and private sectors while protecting the rights of all. We're excited to present our information to TACIR. I wish to thank you for this opportunity to be heard, considered, and the outcome of your response that will be presented to our legislators. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mormon. Are there questions for the gentleman presenter? Yes, sir, Mayor.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mormon. I see you're my resident across the lake, as we say.
Did you want
Few questions for you. I would suggest to you that if I were to ask my constituents who should bear the cost of developing all these subdivisions that all these people are moving into, the answer would be the developer and indirectly the people moving in here buying the homes. That wouldn't surprise you, would it?
No.
And under this legislation that you're proposing, some of that burden would indeed shift to the taxpayers, wouldn't it?
I don't feel it would. I mean, the only thing that's happening here that's different is the private sector is not giving away their property just to get a subdivision done unless it's a major impacting development, and in which case they will be dedicating the right-of-way.
But I thought I understood you to say that currently there's a dedication without compensation, but under this bill, there will be compensation, which seems to me, if the taxpayers have to compensate down the road, then the taxpayers are indeed funding that development.
Let's say there's so many times, I can take you into properties that have been subdivided into 2 lots, 3 lots, 5 lots that have happened 40 years ago. That property has gone and lost the tax revenue off of it. If it would have been left on the rolls, they would have been paying that property owner with money that they've collected over the years.
Whatever the property tax assessment may be on a 5-foot section of property adjacent to a road.
Yes.
And do you have any basis to suggest that the revenue loss from that relatively small parcel would be greater than the cost if the municipality or the county had to purchase it?
That would be dependent on very many factors. How long ago the reservation took place, how much the property had appreciated over the years. But this bill, it is our intention to make sure that it's just raw land that is being compensated if indeed it is ever needed.
Okay. Now, you made the statement that any subdivision, regardless of size, small as just subdividing from one parcel into two, requires a dedication of their property that lies adjacent to the roadway. And I can't speak for Blount County Road Superintendent Jeff Hedrick, but I can speak for my corner of the county, and we approve 2, 3, 4 lot subdivisions regularly. When a parent wants to subdivide and give to a child or grandchildren, there's absolutely no required dedication of right-of-way along an existing right-of-way, whether it be a state or a municipal or a county road. So I'm curious, that seems to be an overstatement on your part, because I know that we approve them and we don't require a dedication of right-of-way.
Well, you're exactly right. Each individual municipality or planning organization can operate on their own, but I have worked in multiple, and most of the times it is required.
And I confess that I'm a Republican, and as such, I tend to follow the principles I was taught and learned. And among those principles is that government is better the more local it is. And shouldn't we leave those decisions locally to the counties, to municipalities, how they want to handle this type of issue, as opposed to having the legislature dictate to us statewide, no matter what the situation is, how it should be handled?
Well, I've been working with my peers across the entire state, and I would state that letting it be handled locally, you are in the far minority. Most are making the dedications happen.
Okay. You cited this to the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution and to to Section 21 of the Tennessee Constitution, Declaration of Rights, as to the prohibition against governmental taking without compensation. But I didn't see that you'd cited any judicial opinions where courts have indicated that that is indeed a taking. Are you aware of any?
Not specifically.
Oftentimes in a subdivision, when we look at it, we'll have the engineers give us guidance as to, for example, how stormwater should be handled, and we may require a section of the development be dedicated to detention. In essence, we're saying, we're going to tell you how that has to be used. You can't build on it. You probably can't sell it. It's probably going to be shown as green space in your development. But the government is telling you how that property must be used if you wish to proceed. Is it your position that action and requiring detention in areas like that is a taking? Because we're telling you how you can use the property, or you can't use it.
No, sir, I wouldn't take that position. That's a choice by the developer. There's many alternatives to, yes, stormwater requirements are a part of good planning, a part of good development, and they're a part of the role. But how that developer chooses to do things, I've worked on developments where underground detention has come into play so that they didn't have to give up area. Worked with pervious pavers so they didn't have to give up area. There are many options available.
Okay. Now, you use the word extortion to describe current practices, and that's seems like a fairly harsh word, and I suspect that was hyperbole and you didn't mean it in its literal sense. Because I want to make sure I understand and we're on the same page as to how a development occurs. Typically, the developer will buy a parcel of property with the intent of developing it for a profit.
Yes, sir.
And there are numerous costs that go into that infrastructure, roads, utilities, and those costs are rolled into the overall cost of that project, right?
Yes, sir.
And then the developer subdivides it, and he sells the lots, or he builds a house on a lot to sell it with the idea that he will obtain a return on the money that has been invested.
Yes, sir.
And the things that the Planning Commission may require to be done in order to get that project approved so that it can generate a return on the investment are things that get rolled into the overall underlying cost of the project and then divided among the many different lots purchased. And so indirectly, the people buying the homes, right, are who's bearing the cost of whatever infrastructure, whatever right-of-ways that the municipality or the county government may require to be provided, not the developer.
Initially he is, but he is getting recompensated by them. But what about the case of the small farmer?
And we have small farmers. Because that's some of who the people come to us and say, I've got 50 acres, right? I want to divide it up. The 5-acre larger parcels typically out of us, but sometimes they want to just give a 1-acre or 2-acre parcel, split it between kids and grandkids. And typically, that can be done without, in my experience, without a dedication of existing right-of-way of a highway or road.
No, sir, as per my previous response, your community is in the minimal, there's not many communities like yours. Most require it, the dedication regardless.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering my questions. That's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Are there other questions? Mayor McDonald?
Could you provide documentation on that statement that that's a minority issue? He's on one side of the state. I'm in Bartlett, Tennessee, on the other end of the state, and most everybody I know does what he's saying in terms of the small divisions of family-owned properties. I would like to see some documentation to back up that statement, please, sir.
Well, and another thing that I would like to see out of this study, I would welcome the opportunity to work with my fellow professionals to acquire that, but I would like to see the statewide highway commissioners represent to this body how many of them are purchasing right-of-way for roadway improvements throughout their county, and how long have they ever, and how often do they do it? Because it's only your major municipal counties. So.
I'd just like to see, something to back it up, please.
Yes, sir, I understand, and we would too. We'd like to see the other side of that spectrum.
I'd be glad for it to be provided.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Thank you, Mayor. And then now Mayor Hall from McKinsey.
Is that right? I think I speak from a small mayor's perspective and a city with a very small budget. We're looking at, less than $5 million. But when we have done projects, and I would say that most of them have been the federal projects for transportation and sidewalks, and we have to get an easement dedication from some of these property owners. The few cases that we have had to compensate them, I don't understand when you say it's the payment is minimal to that person, because we don't have a surveyor, so we have to hire a surveyor. We don't have an appraiser. We have to hire an appraiser, and then we have to pay the property owner on top of that. So yes, that is money out of the taxpayers' pockets. I would go along and say that this needs to be considered to be a local problem rather than a state problem. I think each municipality can figure out what is best for us, rather than Big Brother coming down and saying, this is the blanket rule for all the counties in Tennessee. That's just my feeling. I would also like to add that I do live on a family farm, and it will never be divided. It will be passed on to our children, and it is in the land trust for Tennessee. And so hopefully we won't ever have to worry about it on our farm. But I do think that this is a local problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just loving this new wave of Republicans that I'm hearing from up here that believe in local decisions being made locally. Mayor Bickers, I was about to stand up and give you a slow clap earlier when you said that, but thank you. And I too believe it, and hopefully we can get some of our legislators up here to believe in the same thing too. Good job, you guys. Good job, Mayor.
Thank you. I had a quick question. I know in the communities in which I trade and do business, and we do survey. I'm going to leave my good friend from Hamilton County out of it, but I was just there. They do require it there. A lot of times we create state law not because we don't want locals to do something. It's because it's ambiguous as to what the policy should be. And when the Constitution says that we have to pay people for their land, we just can't take it. And we find out across the state that we are in fact taking other people's property. Extortion is a strong term. I agree with my colleague. I think extortion is an extreme term. But as somebody who sat in a planning commission, they said either you give me the right of way or I won't sign your final plat. That is extortion. And I hate to tell you it happens, but it is happening. So much of the people on this committee understand that that may not be happening in your community, but it is happening. Representative Parkinson and I were shocked a couple years ago when we found out that you can be 12 years old and get married in Tennessee. But the locals had to act and change the state law because we do that. But in this case, we're taking people's property without compensating them for it. It's a different process all over the state. We sometimes give property back to property owners when it's excess property. We sometimes charge them for it. So in order to understand what the process is, the reason for the legislation is to give guidance, not to restrict local folks, because that's not the instance. The reason for the bill is because we are taking people's property without compensating them for it. And that's really it. But I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Representative Love has asked for the floor, and then Mayor McDonald. Representative Love, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have concerns about any situation where landowners may not be aware of what's going to happen to their property. You may have situations where people want to do additions to houses and go to the planning commission and find out they must give up 6 feet of their land just to add on to the side of the house for a sidewalk that may not be built. But you're told if you don't give it up, you can either pay into the sidewalk fund or you can give up 6 feet, but you can't get it done unless you give it away. That happened to me. I'm trying to add on to the side of my house. I was told that I had to give up 6 feet of the front of the house or pay into the sidewalk fund. I said, well, we don't add on to the front of the house, add on to the side. And they said, well, that's the law. I said, well, when are you going to build the sidewalk? We don't know. Well, who's going to cut the grass while it's dedicated? Well, you'll have to. I said, hold on, this don't make sense to me. Thankfully, that's been corrected. And I've been able to add on to the side of the house and cut the front still. So my point is, and the land is still mine. The point is I understand we are trying to figure this out. But I just wanted to add that piece that I too have experienced, having a situation where I could not get a permit to build unless I gave up 6 feet of the land in the front. And so I know it's not the same thing, but it's in that similar vein where landowners just may be in limbo, not knowing what to do and don't want to give up the land that you have been paying property taxes on, and you still got to maintain it. So I just wanted to add that piece in there, Mr. Chairman, that there's much to be discussed, and I hope we can find some resolution to this for landowners and our government entities also, but there's got to be a more peaceful and less excitable solution to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative, and I believe Mayor McDonald's is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question. Is compensation, when you talk about compensation, is your thought that that is only money, that money is the only kind of compensation?
No, sir.
Okay, so I just want us to be sure that we agree that things of value are compensation.
But I don't agree with the fact that just getting to subdivide your property is compensation.
But if you're getting to use the property for, and when I say you, typically in our community, it's somebody who's developing the land and on which they will receive a profit. And by asking for whatever it is they ask to get it subdivided and to have additional needs for the sewer, the water, the roads and other areas, health care providers, police officers, firemen, that they get that value, and that in fact that is a form of compensation, a form of value. And I would hope you weren't saying that's not true.
No, sir, I wasn't. And you represented, your position is mostly it's in the case of larger developments. This has been ongoing legislation for 5 years, 3 out of 5 years. In one of our meetings with the opponents to our legislation, we extended, well, what if we excluded large developments from this legislation in some manner? If we chose to work together here, they pushed away from the table and said, no, we still. So this legislation is primarily earmarked for small developments, family divisions, because they're the ones that are being most hurt by it, and they're not being compensated.
I understand that is true in some places. I won't deny that. But I do know, even in our community, we've had situations where the larger developers have developed and smaller parcels have chosen not to sell. And then it's time, the prices are good enough that those people decide they want to sell. And when you go to ask them about the price of their right-of-way, they're going to take us to court saying it's more valuable than what our appraiser says. So we have an additional cost in attorney's fees because of that by some of those small developers. So that's one of the reasons. Again, we're looking at this, I think, as an entire committee, and we're all brainstorming. I mean, I still love Antonio, and he still loves me. And so I just know that there are occasions, I know in our city, where people have, in fact, tried to use that as a way to hold the city against a hardship and cause them to spend a lot of extra money. So we would need to address that.
Well, that, you know, on an individual level, there's no way we can control that. However, as I shared in my presentation, we will be delineating the properties that do get subdivided as a reservation, and therefore both the current property owner and future property owners down the line will be made aware that it has been reserved for right-of-way purposes, hopefully minimizing any of that.
Thank you.
Appreciate the questions. There are no further for Mr. Mormon. Then our final speaker on this panel is Mr. Charles Schneider, who is the Executive Director of the Tennessee Home Builders Association. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am Charles Schneider of the Home Builders Association of Tennessee. And Mr. Chairman and members, I think y'all have covered probably a lot of what I'm going to talk about here in the discussion. I just want to make clear the home builders did not take a position on the legislation this past session, mainly because concessions during the planning process is part of doing business for our developer members. There's a lot of trade-offs. We don't like those trade-offs a lot of times, but they're a reality for us. So I would like to discuss the right-of-way dedication part of this as part of a broader overview in land regulations. All right, I get to make this work. So I think you all know housing demand is hot right now. It's no surprise to anybody. I want to take a look at the fundamentals on what drives home prices. For us, it's land, labor, and lumber, which includes all building materials. That's sort of our category. Land is the only fixed and limited resource, so land policies contribute to the cost of a new home. Here we are presenting a diagram of an actual rural subdivision outside of an urban area. It's about 30 minutes outside. For our discussion, this subdivision could be anywhere in Tennessee, and I'm gonna have a lot of visuals in here because I'm a visual person. I think it's easier. I want to point out this is a complicated site. It is the longest state highway there at the bottom. I've marked several of the features to highlight the requirements for this development. There was no sewer access in this area, so they installed an alternative sewer system in drip fields. That's in the northwest corner. Stormwater controls, 2 dry stream buffers around drainage from neighboring farmland to the north. It's hard to see in this image, I'll highlight it later, but there is a 20-foot right-of-way in the green buffer along the highway. The orange line marks additional right-of-way that has been set aside for future roadway expansion. Not marked but indicated in the green space in this is in this area there was a minimum 25% green space requirement. The surveyor's legislation addresses the point that a planning commission will allow you to rezone or divide land and reset the zoning. But their question is the additional right-of-way dedication a voluntary process or a mandatory process? Developers deal with this all the time. It's part of what we do. But ordinary property owners are surprised, and that's probably why this legislation is here. In this example, as I said, there's a 20-foot right-of-way that goes along the state highway, and the developer also marked the right-of-way setback to be claimed later. For our conversation today, let's assume the Planning Commission requested or required this concession. The size of this land here appears large enough to accommodate 2 lanes to create a 4-lane divided highway. And I want to really point out that this decision to make that orange dedication impacts not just this property, but it also impacts the adjacent landowners in this process on the north side of the road. Once a road expansion actually goes to take place, the same amount of land will be taken from the east and west portions of those properties because it's very unlikely the engineers are going to then suddenly go from 100% to split back 50-50 and go just road engineers like straight lines. So now that policy is set and committed by what this one property owner did. So looking a little closer, back to this specific site. So yes, from our perspective, the developer perspective, the project lost land, meaning less lots will be available, but the project gets approved. So we can start preparing the lands and selling lots to build houses. There's, of course, plenty of on-site work that the developer does, grading the land, burying utilities, building stormwater controls, wastewater treatment, constructing the streets. In this case, and I want to point, since we sort of talked about this a little bit, in this case, there are 2 entrances required for the subdivision. The developer installed these as well as installed or paid for 2 center turn lanes coming from the west and 2 shoulder exit deceleration lanes coming from the east. Beyond the right-of-way, I want to mention other land use regulations. These come from both TDEC and local subdivision regulations, so not one place. Unfortunately, these regulations compound on each other. In this example, 250 acres of land yields 118 buildable lots on 62 acres. So a lot of land is taken out of production. And I mentioned this is a complicated site with the drainage. You've got green space requirements as well, the setbacks and right-of-way dedication, the stream buffers, stormwater regulations, wastewater regulations. And so getting to sort of the final phase of this development, so this was done in two major phases, and then the third phase is in purple, and I think was approved earlier this year. This final phase is 22 housing lots that are half acres, 11 acres of green space. The Planning Commission approval required an additional $660,000 in bonding requirements for different things that are highlighted there, adding all these sites to the stormwater management plan. And then, of course, once the Planning Commission says go, the developer he absorbs the cost to prepare the lots and install the utilities and streets. And this is just something that I think is important to mention. Even though you've got a half-acre lot, there are setbacks in almost every zoning, and these vary depending upon what the Planning Commission zoning may be and what they sort of want to see in the area. We actually have pretty favorable setbacks on these lots here. The half-acre lots, you've got white space around there. The tan area is what we call the building envelope. That's where you can actually put the house. If you've got a rear-facing garage, your driveway is obviously going to go through that building envelope and around the back, but still plenty of room to build. Landscape buffers are around the perimeter of the property where you can't build to the property line. In this instance, it's 15 feet or more off the property line that they want landscape buffers put in. And so our point is every time you shrink or every time you increase the amount of these different setbacks and requirements, you shrink the amount of buildable land. So just real quickly, these 22 lots, this is how they're laid out. The green there is, at the top is landscape buffer and open space. You can see the Dry Creek stormwater buffer in the darker green, the building envelopes in tan, the streets are in gray, and then you've got all these additional setbacks, which will be grass or lawn or some other type of patio type thing. So hopping back to this slide, I just want to make the point, no one land use policy is bad. But when you add them together, the combination of the regulations and how they compound on each other remove land from production and do make development hard. We always ask all levels of government, so y'all, the local, the state, everyone, to consider your regulations and what runs parallel to those regulations and how they'll impact your actual land use. Which brings us to our final point. Land use requirements always add costs. The question is this: who pays for it? And this is some of the example Mayor sort of brought up earlier. The developer understands the business model here, right? And they're going to price things accordingly. So in this example where we had 250 acres, not all of that is buildable. So the offer to the property owner who owns it is going to be lower than if, let's say, 70% of the land could be built upon. And then the next part of that is the homeowner is going to pay too. The total number of lots approved, this is basic math. The cost of purchasing the land and installing the infrastructure, you divide that by the number of lots, and that's sort of how it comes out. So the initial cost of the lot and the land is going to determine the eventual home price. And just to wrap up, and I know I threw a lot of information at you, and I can go back to any of my fun colored pictures. We measured and absorbed the initial mandatory setback concessions on the perimeter. This development, with pretty minimal setbacks, lost 6% of its area without considering the more complicated open space and stormwater, wastewater regulations. When we add it all up, it's about 14.9 acres. I was pretty conservative in that orange right-of-way. I only used 60 feet. It's actually marked at about 100 feet on this, so you could add another 4 acres in there. But again, I'm just going to close. Home Builders Association, our point is this: you can't look at any single land use restriction in isolation. All the zoning pieces come together, and they all play a role in limiting land use, which may or may not be a bad thing, but it does impact the price of homes. So when you're looking at prices of homes in your communities, you know, if you've got $20,000 lots, you can build an affordable house on there. but that same house on a $200,000 lot is going to be $200,000 more. And Mr. Chairman, I rest.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. We appreciate your remarks. Are there questions? Mayor McDonald, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Schneider, how many of the counties or cities would allow you to do what we do in Bartlett, and that is to come forward with a plan where you would not lose any structures? You just would build them on smaller lots because you recognize, as we recognize, they're not buildable lots. A lot of the times it's because the state makes them green streams. So we'll take it back to the state on that, right? Why you can't use a lot of that property. But we try to find a way. Now, is that not practiced in a lot of the areas in Tennessee?
So again, I'm not condemning the planning commission process. I do think where you are in West Tennessee has very different challenges than Sevier County, for example.
Right.
You just have very different topography. Our point is when you have the state environmental regulations and the zoning regulations, if they're sort of not synced up, it can really take a lot out of production. I do think on this specific location, because they're taking such a large piece of dedication there for right-of-way, there's probably a roadway expansion in the works or in the plan, right? I mean, they're taking a 2-lane state highway, and they've saved enough space to put in 2-lane divided. As I sort of started, our developers understand the concessions they go into. And most of them, a developer is pretty familiar with the planning commissions in the area and sort of know what they like. I would say it would be much harder if you took a developer out of East Tennessee and plucked him into Shelby County. It would be harder for him to get something approved because he's less familiar with what the requirements are and what some of the issues are. So a lot of these things do have a local focus, but in general, the uniformity for us is not just statewide, it's also understanding all the different regulations and how they work together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Anderson, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm the only county mayor up here. So I think you've definitely got lines between municipalities and county mayors. In the county that I represent, we're probably a little different than some of the other counties. I acknowledge that. But several of the people sitting up here also have real estate in our county and live and have their family members there. So it's a very desirable place in which to live. We've also feed our development people to death, as you're well aware of.
Yes, sir.
We have a privilege tax, adequate school facility tax, adequate tax on the roads, and we have an educational impact fee. And they still keep coming there. We have built an infrastructure there as public schools. If you want to come and live in Williamson County, you're going to pay. And I've been there a long time, 20 years, 16 years as a county commissioner, never backed down once. The people will pay for live in a community in which there's solid educational standards and which there's plenty of jobs. And we started that journey in 1986. I personally believe that, as some of the colleagues here have expressed, that infrastructure management and the planning of the county transportation areas ought to be left up to the locals. My late good friend, best friend I had was Charles Sargent. I was his campaign manager. Many of you knew that. We would argue till the cows came home that if you're going to do something up here in Nashville, send some money down with it. Don't just make the law changed. Don't just change the law. And I still stand by that, and I believe that it's working in our county. As far as which way is right, I can understand some of the legislation that's proposed here, but it's not broke in every county, gentlemen. It's just not broke. And you look at Rutherford County, where you're from, It's not broke. And I will say one last thing, Mr. Chairman. We went out on a limb 3.5 years ago to figure out a way to how to pay for all of these costs, because all of us as elected officials here, we're weighed on something called tax increases, which, you know, may or may not be the best way to judge me, but that's how we're elected oftentimes within the community. Communities that vote, other than a presidential election, they'll vote 25, 30%. And whoever's got the biggest advertising dollar can persuade some other people to vote against you or for you. And at the end of the day, it's a lot easier for us as elected officials to do some of the things in fees. And if you've got a desirable place, the development seems to want to come there. That's been my experience. So 3.5 years ago, Mr. Chairman, a penny in my county generates $1.5 million. 10 years ago, our assessed value in Williamson County was $30 billion. 10 years later, we just finished up on 12/30 of this year. It was $65 billion. Took us 221 years to get to $30 billion. Took us 10 years to double it. That's an amazing figure when you look at it. But the people were saying, slow this rascal down. Slow this growth down. I'm sure nobody else up here has that problem. But we have a problem. How do we pay for the schools? And schools run about 60, 65 million. We build one at a high school every 18 months. Elementary, middle, or high school. One every 18 months. And they're kind of expensive. And people don't want you to raise their taxes. And you can't, the schools, if you understand the mechanics of the way that the money flows, county commission has to pay for that. That note is bound over to the county commission side. And so that's a part on the accounting standards. So 3.5 years ago, we decided we've got to do something. People kept beating us up out in the unincorporated area, so well, let's go to 5-acre lots. I don't know if another community would even tackle that. And let me tell you, I did swallow deep when they said we're going to go to 5-acre lots. Took us 1.5 years to get there. We got there. The vote was 22 to 1, if I remember correctly, to go to 5-acre lots in the unincorporated area. And now what do we do with those urban growth boundaries that all of us have to deal with? So we're getting back together, trying to find out some solutions to that. 6 months after passing a 5-acre lot, Mr. Chairman, we had the largest next 60 days worth of building permits we'd ever had in the history of our county. Because they want to move there, whether you're charging or not, but it penalizes county highway departments. My road superintendent is appointed. He's one of the best in the state. Rodney Carmichael, who just stepped down, has done a great job fighting these battles for us. And to look and change this now is going to cost county highway money. That's it. In a growing county like we've got and you've got, that's a problem. And I understand your comments as a land surveyor. But there's not one development losing money because they just keep on coming back. That's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Frank?
Yes, Mr. Schneider, to your point about the cost, I think even the current sitting president is looking at that issue in terms of affordable housing. So they're actually discussing some type of preemption in order to address, some of the planning that we do that is driving up the cost of development. But I don't know if this question is for you or Mr. Moorman, but I guess one of the things that I'm looking at on this is the inequity of why some are paid and some aren't. And so even if you don't want to accept Mr. Moorman's idea that it is an improper taking without compensation,
that inequity that it just so happens when you transfer the property or what you're trying to do, one gets paid, one doesn't, that's a glaring problem that we need to address. But maybe one of you knows, you know, you made reference to the fact that often we are dedicating more land than needs to be dedicated and that is ever actually used. Do you know, is anyone tracking that data, looking at that at the state, the property assessors? Do we have any way of measuring that at all?
Measuring it statewide, I would hesitate to say. But I would tell you, Hardin Valley Road, which you being from Anderson County, you're very well aware of. Our Planning Commission is asking for an 88-foot wide right-of-way through there. When they widened the road, they purchased a 56-foot wide right-of-way. So, so you go down that right-of-way today, and as I showed those offsets because of dedications, even with them making a purchase along the entire roadway, there's still those offsets where those communities, those property owners were adversely treated. But I can't answer it statewide, ma'am.
Okay.
So I would say from the and this sort of goes to something Mayor McDonald said on what is compensation. When we're doing concessions and trade-offs, if in fact on that piece of property, that orange line was a hard dedication, we would have negotiated probably for what I was talking about, the building lot setbacks. Those are pretty favorable in this area. So we may have said, okay, you know, maybe let's say the initial plan had 80 houses on here, or all 118 were closer to the road. If they said, hey, we want this amount of setback, we would have said, okay, we need greater density. We need the ability to put houses a little closer together so we can fit all this in.
Okay.
So I think that there is an exchange from the developer, but if you're an individual property owner, you're completely unaware of this process and quite honestly on your back foot, even having the conversation to know how to, you know, ask the right question to get out of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there other questions for the panel? Representative, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Orman, you asked earlier about, or you stated earlier about TDOT and local municipalities taking right away. Do you, I had an opportunity to talk to TDOT, but where is TDOT on this idea of, are you, I think I know the answer, but I thought I'd ask you.
TDOT is of the position that if you don't have enough money to do the road widening and purchase the right-of-way, it doesn't happen because it's not right.
So TDOT's not here today because they purchased all the right-of-way they need?
Yes, sir. Yeah. And then in the case, as I pointed out, our planning agencies are having us dedicate additional right-of-way along state routes to the local governments. Well, there's two things that have to happen for a dedication to take place legally. One, the person has to be willing to dedicate it. Two, the second entity has to formally accept it. I would challenge you that I brought this position to my local government, both city and county, and stated, y'all are not reading into the minutes that you're accepting all these right-of-ways along existing dedications. Well, but that's just you're technically right, but that's just the way we're doing it. But again, back to the state roadways. Why are we dedicating to a city or a county property along a state roadway that the state will not take that dedication?
And I had a question for Mr. Schneider. The question is, you did a great job, Home Builder Association does a great job communicating with our districts as it relates about these large multi-unit or multi-parcel land developments. Do you have I have data for Putnam County as it relates to what percentage are those type of the total number of lots. I wondered if you might have that.
I don't have a total number. This is what I would say is, I think Mayor McDonald sort of discussed earlier, you know, large development goes around and you've got these other smaller parcels, let's say 5 acres that someone goes in. When you take those perimeter setbacks in a lot of places, if they're too extreme, you really can't even use that to put it in a development because the lot is too narrow. You may be able to go to the planning commission and sort of negotiate your way out of that, but it's all these things in combination on the perimeter and the interior that do this. I would say probably the majority of new homes are probably in subdivisions that are less than 200 acres. Which makes it really difficult, though, is a subdivision may start off at 100 acres and have multiple phases and get bigger. Because the state law, to use the general construction permit, you can only disturb 50 acres at a time. And so sometimes, the mayor of Williamson County, Mr. Anderson just mentioned, people come in there, they have a host of different subdivisions that started out 300, 400, and the back part of the property kept growing over time. So nobody sort of starts with a 10,000 acre subdivision, but they do grow that way.
Right. I think you answered a really good question that I may not have asked. So let me state it again, and maybe you can answer it differently. In Putnam County, 2016, of all the subdivision plats that we did, 88.1% of them were 3 lots or less. That was the question. So, I mean, we can use this as an example, but I guess in Putnam County in 2016, only the other 12% of those were 6 lots or greater.
I would say if the county population is under 100,000 people, that is probably true.
Okay.
When it is larger than that, there's a lot more large land use.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no objection, I'd like to move us on to the next item on our calendar today. Thank you to the panel for a job well done, very informative, and to the members for the very good questions that were asked. If we could have Dr. Van Zandt and Dr. Barkin come up. And while they're coming up here, I'd be remiss, I believe I saw Rodney Carmichael come in, the immediate past director of the County Highway Supervisors Association. We're delighted to have you here, and thank you for your service. Just because I'm reading this presentation, I'm turning it over to you. There's no statement on my part.
Okay. I'm going to leave my obese vice chairman
No, you
in
misinterpreted.
charge.
Kevin, are we ready? All right, if I can have everyone's attention, we will get into the General Assembly through Public Chapter 503 has asked this body to look into the issue of childhood obesity, and because of that, we have this informational presentation for you today, and I will turn it over to our research associate, Dr. Kevin Van Zandt, who will get us started into the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Kevin Van Zandt. I'm a research associate, and I'm pleased to be introducing today's speaker for the Childhood Obesity Project. As the Chairman mentioned, the study comes to the Commission from Public Chapter 503, Acts of 2021, which requires TACIR to perform a comprehensive evaluation on the socioeconomic impact childhood obesity has in Tennessee and its short and long-term effects. The memo for this presentation can be found under tab 4. Childhood obesity has many consequences for Tennessee's health and economy. Children classified as obese are more likely to have high blood pressure and high cholesterol, impaired glucose tolerance and type 2 diabetes, and breathing and joint problems, among other physical ailments. Childhood obesity is also related to psychological problems such as anxiety and depression, low self-esteem, and lower self-reported quality of life, and social problems such as bullying and stigma. And Tennessee, for the last several years, has consistently ranked among the states with the highest rates of childhood obesity. Today, the Commission will hear from Dr. Sherry Barkin, the Chief of General Pediatrics and the Director of Pediatric Obesity Research in the Diabetes Center at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Her research focuses on childhood obesity and the effectiveness of family-based, community-centered interventions during critical windows of early childhood development. Beyond her clinical research, Dr. Barkin has also supported public policy initiatives in the state and was a key advisor to the Tennessee Obesity Task Force and its creation in 2010 of a statewide nutrition and physical activity plan to help reduce obesity and chronic disease in Tennessee. This is our first opportunity to discuss this study in a commission meeting, and we are delighted to have an expert of Sherry Barkin's stature here to help us begin our discussion on this very important topic. Dr. Barkin will be utilizing a PowerPoint, as you see, and you should have copies of those slides in your docket book materials. Unless there are any questions for me, I'll ask Dr. Barkin to start her presentation.
Thank you all. Can you hear me?
You may have to turn the
Testing. Yeah, better? Great. Good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity. Today, I'll discuss the impact of childhood obesity on health, economics, and even national security. I'll explain why it's important to intervene early and with sufficient and sustained effort to intervene effectively. So you can see that the trends in prevalence of childhood obesity have more than tripled from the 1960s to the 2000s. It leveled off somewhere around 17% for the prevalence of childhood obesity. And the question is, why? So what's changed from the 1960s to the 2020s? And in a word, everything. We live in an obesogenic environment. It's very easy to have quick access to cheap, low-nutrient foods that, by the way, taste delicious. It's very easy not to move really a muscle unless you're using this finger to scroll either up or down or right or left. And this is actually not how our bodies were built. We are built with the intention to move and to eat actually to sustain only what we need, not excess. Now, what does this look like in terms of the impact for Tennessee? Well, Tennessee is ranked 4th in adolescent obesity. It's at about 20%. These numbers have gone up since the pandemic. Tennessee is one of only 3 states where preschool age obesity is increasing instead of decreasing. And about 2 out of 3 adults are overweight or obese in Tennessee. Since the pandemic, it's closer to 40% of adults who are obese. Obesity itself is a disease and a risk factor for common chronic diseases. You heard Dr. Van Sant talk about how it's associated highly with common chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure. There are 13 forms of cancer that it's associated with, as well as excessive surgeries for things like gallbladder. But I'm here today to talk to you about childhood obesity. And why is that? Obesity behaves like a chronic disease, and by that I mean that it gets worse as you get older. It emerges in early childhood or adolescence, and if it does emerge during those time periods, then it's more likely to remain that way into adulthood, with about 80% of adolescents who have obesity remaining obese into adulthood. So intervening early is really critical to change those trajectories away from disease and towards health. This impacts healthcare costs significantly nationally and here in Tennessee. Childhood obesity is estimated to cost about $14 billion annually in direct health expenses. That sounds like a lot to me until you start looking at what that means when it tracks into adulthood. In adults, the costs are between $147 and $210 billion a year. That's nationally. It's projected that if the current prevalence continues, that the cost will continue to rise. Now, a long time ago, 2014 in Tennessee, we also looked at these costs. And the costs at that time, when the prevalence was lower, indicated additional health care costs for obesity at around $2.5 billion. So if adult obesity rates could decrease from that 40% of today to 2009's average of 27%, $500 million in health care costs a year could be saved.
And what about economics? Obesity-related job absenteeism costs about $4 billion annually. Employees who are obese miss more work from short-term absences and long-term disabilities than employees who are non-obese. And employers pay higher life insurance premiums and pay out more for workers' compensation. Now, I bring this up not to at all put the burden on the adult who is now obese, but instead to focus on what it is that we can do to prevent that trajectory. Importantly, childhood obesity also has a very significant impact on national security. Nearly 1 in 4 young people are ineligible to serve in the military because of their weight. And in fact, even among active duty service members, obesity has risen by 73% over a short time period of 2011 to 2015. So this is why I am so grateful that you all are looking into this issue. This is a tough thing to address. What makes this hard, and what is the way forward? Well, a lot of people, when they think about obesity, and I'm very popular at parties, everyone has the solution. It's just, eat less and move more. It's a pretty straightforward calculation. I wish it were that easy. And why isn't it that easy? Well, you can see on one side for nutrition, the great majority of Americans eat foods that look like this. These are ultra-processed foods. They're cheaper. They taste delicious. You can find them anywhere. The problem is that they're very high in calories and low in nutrients. So we have this interesting paradox. As you're seeing more and more obesity, it also tracks with higher degrees of malnutrition. And 1 in 6 to 8 children in Tennessee don't know where their next meal is coming from. We call that food insecurity. But I can tell you that the next meal that they have looks a lot like this. Now, if I am my age, which is not a child, and I decide to have a delicious pizza, fantastic. It is not going to affect me if I, at this moment in time, decide to have pizza. But if I am young and I'm a toddler and I'm eating pizza every day, that actually changes how I function physiologically. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to be looking through the lens of childhood development to show you how these associations, exposures to poor quality food and decreased amounts of physical activity, affect how your body functions and sets you up for later chronic disease. So before I move into that, I just want you to imagine this as a metaphor. So if you imagine that you are born and you have this shiny car that you get to drive, it really depends on the type of gas that you're going to be putting in as to how well that car is going to run and how far it will go. You also need to use the car. You need to make sure you are turning that engine over and making it go so that it stays in good function. And then it needs some regular tune-ups. So similarly to that, if you put poor fuel into a car over time, it accumulates and affects the way that that car functions for the lifetime of the car, probably shortening that. So we understand that we look at individual behavior change as we talk about things. It's also important to understand how larger societal forces affect individual choices and behavior. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my time is I'm really going to focus through the lens of childhood development, because these exposures, poor quality fuel and not using your car very regularly, have very different effects on whether you will go on to have higher risk for chronic diseases. If you're exposed to them during pregnancy, infancy and toddlerhood, preschool period, elementary, and adolescence. So I start with pregnancy. There's a lot of evidence that both maternal obesity and a high-fat diet during pregnancy affects later functioning and obesity in the offspring. It affects not only your metabolism and your basal metabolic rate, but it actually affects your liver, depositing fat in your liver, and it affects the way you store fat. So just as a reminder, fat isn't a bad thing. Fat is brilliant. This is the way that we are able to have access to energy so that in times of famine, we can still function and survive. It's when you have excess adiposity that no longer fits inside of your fat cells and instead moves into your heart, your pancreas, your liver, and other elements that it becomes really dangerous. So the other piece that I just wanted to mention that I find fascinating is that exposure to a high-fat diet during pregnancy affects the way an infant perceives being hungry or full. So those infants tend to eat 20% more before they're satisfied. So creating high-quality, affordable foods during pregnancy is really important. 2 for 1 improves the health of the mother and the baby. The second period is infancy and toddlerhood. And I just want you to notice that this is what I see. When I am in clinic, I'm always looking to see how children are growing. And you're going to see right in the middle, that's just a normal growth curve. You can see that you should be growing over time. Your weight and your height usually are concomitantly growing in this period of time of infancy and toddlerhood. But what we're seeing in clinic now is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen. Rather than following those curves, you're jumping across those lines. And that type of rapid weight gain without concomitant growth in height during the first 3 months of infancy is linked with insulin sensitivity and reduced insulin sensitivity and type 2 diabetes for adults, young adults, and adolescents that are 18 and 24. So I just want now you to take a look at that top screen and tell me, which baby do you think is more at risk for obesity and later type 2 diabetes? What you're seeing here is a baby that has a low amount of adiposity and a baby that has a higher amount, so a smaller for gestational age and larger. Who do you think has a higher risk? I encourage you to just let me know, what do you think? Smaller? So interesting that you said that. Any other thoughts? This is a great question because either answer is right. They actually have the exact same risk for type 2 diabetes and obesity later in life, but physiologically you get there from a different way. So we also know that rapid infant growth in that first 24 months has an increased odds of obesity at age 5 and 10. It's 2-fold higher. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this story from pregnancy is to understand that these things have cumulative effects, and early exposure affects what we're seeing later. So you have to have the long view when you look at children. And why is it that we see these rapid infant weight gains? I'm sure we could have deep conversations about it. This is one reason. We expose our infants and toddlers in America to these main food groups: candy, chicken nuggets, snacks, pizza, sodas, and hot dogs, starting in infancy. In fact, a great number of our infants are exposed to at least one of these food categories, which is not what we teach our medical students. It should be fruits and vegetables, by the way, please. And lean protein is also quite good and appropriate amounts of fat. So you can see that once you're a toddler, it's about 4 times a day that you're exposed to those foods. And being exposed to these foods is like putting a bad quality fuel in your body, and it gums up the system, your heart, your pancreas, and many other elements of your body function. So you might be thinking, well, those are just some parents that are making bad decisions. But here's the reality of that. Those foods, which again are very prevalent and pretty low cost as well and taste good, we see that they are more prevalent, they are more affordable than these foods that are higher in than fruits and vegetables that cost more than these lower nutrient foods. So nutrition, of course, is one of those elements. That's the fuel that you're putting in your body. It matters through all of these childhood periods. I'm going to turn to the preschool period and physical activity. So children who have physical activity, who have parents that are physically active, are 6 times more likely to be physically active. And here's the good news about physical activity. You don't have to lose a pound. If you are physically active and it's 60 to 90 minutes a day when you are this age, when you're a preschooler, and at least 30 minutes a day when you're our age as adults, that can improve your insulin sensitivity and your blood pressure even without losing a pound. It's really important. It also improves mental clarity, it decreases ADHD, and has many, many other benefits. It's very much associated with access to parks and greenways that are safe. And I am really proud about Tennessee and brag about this when I talk across the country, because here in Davidson County, we have an incredible resource of green space, of parks and rec, of playgrounds, and that makes a really big difference. We know more access to those elements increases the likelihood of physical activity. In Tennessee, my group has worked with Parks and Recreation, and we've developed family-based physical activity program, 2-for-1, improving parent physical activity and child physical activity together. So what about school-age children? What happens in that school-age period? You're having that cumulative effect if you're not running that car regularly and not getting your tune-ups and not putting in high-quality fuel. And that cumulative effect of poor nutrition and sedentary lifestyle worsens weight gain over time. It is harder, I don't know if any of you have had to struggle with this, it is harder to lose weight as you get older. It is much easier to intervene early. And the good news here is that we do know that intensive behavioral interventions provided in primary care providers' offices, weight management clinics, and then working with our community partners like the YMCA and Parks and Recreation and Boys and Girls Club, that this results not only in weight loss, but it improves blood pressure and cholesterol. You have to intervene in a timely way. These recommendations, of course, require that neighborhood and environmental contexts which affect our behavior need to be addressed, and that's things like traffic and crime and sidewalks and green space. In our studies, we found that parents reported that they weren't sending their children out to play in certain parts of Nashville because of a stray dog problem. So your environment really affects how you interact with it. So I'd like to turn lastly to this period of adolescence. I don't know if you have adolescents in your life, but you know they are changing pretty dramatically. Your metabolism changes, your hormones change. It's a really sensitive and important period of development. We know that if you are overweight by the time of adolescence, you're 3 times as likely to develop heart disease in your 30s and 40s. And if you're obese at the time of adolescence, you're 7 times as likely to develop heart disease in your 30s and 40s. Early intervention and prevention is the most effective tool we have in our toolbox. But if we are unable to do that effectively, we need to intervene in timely, effective, sustained ways. So here is what I am seeing in clinic. I am seeing a dramatic rise in Tennessee in severe obesity. That's when your body mass index is greater than the 99th percentile. That might not mean very much to you. I can tell you, I just saw on Monday an adolescent who had a BMI that is twice the size of me in her body. And that severe obesity requires a very different type of intervention. So what is that? For these very severe cases, bariatric surgery appears to be the only thing that seems to be effective. This is a study that came out a while ago, 5 years ago. It was done across the country. 242 kids participated. They were 13 to 19 at the time of bariatric surgery. And they followed them for 3 years and saw that they had a mean weight decrease of 27%. The remission of type 2 diabetes was 95%. The remission of abnormal kidney functions, 86%. Remission of elevated blood pressure, 74%. And then remission of dyslipidemia, all that cholesterol and the low and high HDLs, by 66%. So what's optimal timing? Clearly, we want to prevent this. If you're at this stage here in adolescence, earlier is better to reduce associated chronic diseases and their effects. Disease remission remains higher, and it appears to be the only successful long-term treatment options for these adolescents who have this form of severe obesity. But of course, risks exist, and it would be better to prevent when possible. So I hope what I have done this afternoon is just laid your foundation as you begin to explore what this is for Tennessee and what we can do, recognizing that obesity is a chronic disease that begins in childhood, and intervening effectively takes this life course long approach, focused on what we can do at each phase of childhood development. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I would welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Mayor Hall.
This is information is great, and I think we're all very aware of this, and I think we're all very concerned in our own communities about childhood and adult obesity and what it does to their health. What do you think, as without getting into people's personal lives and and becoming Big Brother, what are, we hear, well, get out and exercise more, or like you say, have the playgrounds. What are incentives for parents to take this route? What, as government officials, can we do without being dictatorial? What do you see? I mean, some states, everybody's healthy, and then Tennessee, we're not.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that incredibly easy question.
Good.
So I would say that the key things that are important is we have to understand what sort of drives our behavior, processes, and systems. So a lot of what we do is sort of automatic. I'm sure that as you all get in your car, you're not really paying attention to where you're going. You just end up there. These default settings that you have in your environment make a really big difference. I'll give you an example there. Disney is the world's largest restaurateur, the Disney Corporation. They have more restaurants than, I think, almost any other corporation nationally. And they did this interesting experiment. What they did was they just changed the default. So when you come through the line to get your food, you get your child's meal. And the default for your child's meal includes milk and fruit, and you are welcome to change it. You can say, no, I want fries and soda, or I would like apple juice. You can absolutely do that. But the great majority of people don't usually do it. They take what was in front of them and they eat that. The other thing that's interesting about how we eat, and I welcome a lot of deeper conversation about this, is we usually eat kind of mindlessly. Do you know how long the average American takes to eat? How many minutes do you think? What did you say? 17, a little bit shorter than that. That's a great guess. 11 minutes. And do you know your body is actually designed so that your stomach doesn't tell your brain you're full until about 20 minutes. So it's really easy to overeat with this sort of mindless overeating. So there was another experiment. I'm going to get back to giving you my very specific recommendations or some guideposts here. But there was a really important study that showed that people were given stale popcorn, and they were given a small bag, and they were given a large bag. And they were invited to come back as many times to fill up that popcorn. And people just ate to the bottom of the bag. I'm sure that you might have that experience yourself. I certainly see that with kids with Doritos and going to the bottom of the bag. So one thing that I think is something that we can consider is just how do we create our default options? And still allowing for choice, but creating default options to make it really simple and easy and affordable to have good, healthy foods. So that's one element. I think also, Mayor, your question is about incentives. And I think that most of the participants and the patients that I work with, they really want to be healthy for their kids. And so having opportunities to be physically active with their kids and having the time to do that is important. As part of the Tennessee Obesity Task Force from about a decade ago, we worked with employers like Nissan, and they started changing their policies to give you more time to be physically active and still ensure that you were paid for a period of time. Just having a little bit more space in your day and setting up your day, whether you are in school, and if you are a preschooler, having 10 minutes of physical activity every hour, which will get you enough physical activity and is very consistent with how you move and associated with better learning, and doing similar things in schools. Setting those defaults where they make sense is one of the tools that we have in our toolbox.
Thank you, Mayor Holland. I think Senator Yarbrough was waiting for the floor, and then Vice Chairman. Senator Yarbrough, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for being here. It was a remarkably sobering assessment, and I think all of us kind of recognize this is a problem that is massive. But I think my question is similar to the previous because it feels like you're trying to shift culture and built environments and how people can and should shop, and it's hard to separate this into pieces that are easy for us to try to think about how to move the dial in a way that is appropriate for the state government or local governments to do. And I wonder if there's a way that we should think about different components of this problem, or how do you organize this just kind of conceptually?
Sure. So I think what I've done here is I've broken it out. If you look through that developmental lens and you think about, well, what are the levers that you all have at your disposal to enhance high quality, affordable, accessible food during pregnancy? And you all know the policies better than I. There are many things that Tennessee has that can be, I think, fully utilized to achieve that during pregnancy. Likelihood in infancy and toddlerhood, for example, the Women, Infant, and Children's Program is one of the few things that has been shown statewide to actually reduce early childhood obesity. The challenge in Tennessee, we've got Women, Infant, and Children's, it's not being fully utilized. And so further exploring what can augment utilization, that's a lever that you already have at your disposal. Likewise, when you look at the preschool period and the school age period, in the past, when I was part of the Tennessee Obesity statewide task force, there was a great momentum around just regular physical activity in the school setting. The way that looks in the preschool period, and we've been able to show this with my research as well, is if you can just in a preschool period ensure 10 minutes of physical activity every hour when you're in school, of really moving and having something fun like a dance party, you will get to the right amount of physical activity, which helps build muscle mass, which changes metabolism, which changes the likelihood of improving insulin sensitivity and reducing those chronic diseases later. Likewise, in schools, while we had a law really encouraging physical activity in schools, there's so many competing priorities in the school. So if this is something that is a priority, then we have the tools to help teachers. And in fact, many teachers love using something called Go Noodle. I don't know for the mayors if you've heard about this. What's great about Go Noodle is the teachers love it, the kids love it. You can also create the bridge from school to home, which I think is critical. We can't hope that we make a difference by just focusing on one context. We have to connect those together. And then for school age, I think it's about ensuring that we are covering for insurance purposes. If we can cover more of that intensive connection for behavioral change, using all of these great green spaces that I know that are in many of your communities, that's really helpful. I can tell you, as I've worked with Parks and Recreation for now almost 14 years since I've been here, they need more support because the number of people that want to use those incredible resources is high. Opening them up on Saturdays and Sundays could make a huge difference. And then I would say for adolescents who have severe forms of obesity, ensuring that insurance companies can pay for bariatric surgery if it comes to that. So these are levers that I believe you all have access to, many of which actually you've already got that on that, you've already sort of turned the dial there. It's turning the volume up on it. Thank you, Senator.
Vice Chairman Brooks.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman. Two questions, Dr. Barkin. Thank you for being here. It was very insightful. The opening memo, so it might be better to Dr. Van Zant, mentions Tennessee's consistently ranked among the states with the highest rates. You talk about tripled from the 60s to the 2000s. What actual percentage rate is the state of Tennessee? We're 47th, 48th.
Please.
And then I do have a follow-up for Dr. Barkin.
Sure.
Yeah, the context is these all affect ages, different age groups, but the most recent number we have for children to 10 to 17, which I think was on slide 4, was 20.4%. So just for context, the national average was 15.5%. So that has Tennessee, for that age group, being about 5% higher. You have 3 states that have a higher obesity rate, so we're the 4th worst. Kentucky, Mississippi, and South Carolina.
So we're 4th from the bottom.
Yeah.
That's right.
That's right.
Not where we want to be.
Mm-mm.
Follow-up question. As a father and grandfather, thank you, and recovering legislator, many years that I was here, we debated and legislated about food deserts.
Mm-hmm.
Parts of the city of Cleveland that these children are suffering the most from both lack of options
Right.
and obesity are simply because there are no options.
Right.
The food desert problem in urban areas is real.
That's right.
And it's not, and rural I'm hearing, it's not that we don't want to switch the options like Disney and offer them milk and fruit. There just simply are no options of that nature. And I'm interested to hear how you feel about that.
Yeah, I think this is a really nice way to tie all of these together. So when we go back to Mayor Holland's point about incentivizing grocery stores to move into those areas and learning from what worked and what didn't work when other places tried that, so we can look at what the best practice toolkits are to create true choice and options, really important. So we call them food deserts and food swamps. And the swampy part is when it's very easy for you to get a lot of sugary sweetened beverages and chips. That creates that swamp. The desert part is when you can't find anything that is really healthy for you and also affordable. And just a comment there, something we do with our students, our medical students at Vanderbilt, is we give you a certain amount of money in your pocket, and we say, you start from here, figure out your bus route, this is what you have to buy. A watermelon that's not rotten, it's in the summer usually when they're starting, 2% milk, and some bananas that are not brown. And they have to use that amount of money in their pocket to figure out the bus system and to look to see how in the zip code where many of our families come from, where would they find those things and could they afford it with that in their pocket? And it's really eye-opening. So I love the incentive question because in addition to all these things in the toolkit, creating economic incentives that are good for business and good for health, that is clearly one of the tools in our toolbox. Thank you for the question.
Representative Williams and then Mayor Frank.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. My recovering friend, Mayor Brooks, from being a state representative, this is something that we talk about a lot in the state, not just food deserts, but food insecurity and those kinds of things. I guess, but this, for many of us probably this information isn't new. Obviously, we've been at the bottom for a while. I guess the question is, one thing that I haven't heard in the past and in your presentation today is who's moving the needle in the last decade? What states are doing that? You know, is everyone more or less sedentary in their, to use a word, in their place, or have some states, and then what have those states done to do that? I think when Vice Chairman Brooks was in the House, we looked at eliminating the sales tax on unprepared food as an incentive to get people to figure out how to cut up a whole chicken, which lasts longer and it's better for you, and incentivize people to buy fruit. I guess I wonder if those states that are moving the needle are doing things like that, or what it is that they're doing, because, you know, plagiarism is the greatest form of flattery. I think I'm quite frankly, I'm tired of having the discussion and not really effectuating much change. But appreciate your presentation and thought maybe you could answer that question if you can.
Great, and I think that that's going to be a big part of what this particular report is going to give you a full comprehensive assessment of. I'm going to name a couple of things, and I think that's the right approach, is to look across the similar states to ours that have done better. So why does North Carolina do better than Tennessee? I think we often look in Nashville, we say our sister city is often Charlotte, and they have really different outcomes than Nashville does. That, to me, is the right approach to understand it. I can tell you a little bit when I look at the information from the Nashville to Charlotte and why they do better. There are some things that they have identified, like ensuring that you have affordable access to healthy foods, in really hot spotting and looking at sort of the distribution and creating incentives for businesses. There is a lot of utilizing businesses and the large businesses in the city as one of the key lever points to improving not only employee health, but employee families' health, so you can amplify effectiveness. Something else Charlotte does is they have a really similar size parks and recreation to us, but they have probably twice as much staff, and that allows them to expand their programs. I think those are exactly the right questions to be asking, and part of this report, if I'm correct, Dr. Van Zandt, will address that for you.
Yeah, this is very early in the study, but it's a great question. And one of the things we've already come across is there's so many moving parts to this problem that you'll have, and some of the frustration of policymakers is you'll have an effort and make a positive change, but you want to address other aspects. So then you lose sort of funding, motivation for that policy change, even though in and of itself it's a positive thing. So let's say you create a sidewalk, which is positive for physical activity, but you do it in a food desert, then you haven't moved the needle at all, even though that may be been a positive thing to do. So what we're looking at the very beginning of this project is the most exciting thing that's happening in other communities and other states is efforts to take on that comprehensive aspect. And they're doing it in small locations, and they're trying to get multiple agencies, private industry involved, and they're seeing if you can get better results from a sort of a cumulative, broad-based approach.
I just want to underscore that, because this is not a one thing at a time. It really is the interaction of how these things work together. It's got to be comprehensive and sustained. Thank you for that question.
Mayor Frank.
Thank you, Doctor. I have a couple of questions and I guess kind of a comment. One of the things in our county, we've seen utilization of WIC go down, and what we hear is that, well, because the choices are limited, and the choices are limited to healthier foods. And so I'm wondering if there are any studies out there that track the supplemental food programs with the obesity rates. And I can look at a couple of my systems where Norwood Elementary, Bryceville Elementary, we have the highest obesity rates. And we also have the highest poverty rates.
That's right.
And I'm sure, many of the fellow members here have been behind a family using assistance, and it's all the wrong foods. It's all the processed, it's all the easy, it's all the cheaper foods that go greater distances. So I'm wondering, if we as policymakers, I don't really want to go down the path of limiting choices, but maybe that's the direction we need to go. And I say that in looking as well when the contracts come across the desk for our schools. They have certain standards, but yet I still see hyper-processed foods and the frozen nuggets and all of the things and the high carbs that just seem to be really at the root of the problem. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
So the question is, what do we do about that?
Yes.
Right, okay.
On the right choice. I mean,
right.
It's more than just, I don't think we can cheerlead our way to telling them that, broccoli is the better choice. if that makes sense.
Sure. Well, I've done a lot of work working specifically with Head Start and Head Start families, and actually kids are more open than sometimes the adults are to trying those sorts of healthy foods. And something that we've learned that's really important is that a lot of the families that I serve, many of them they've lost sort of the art of cooking. And so part of our research programs, we've designed Teaching Kitchen Outreach that actually teaches kids how to cook healthy. And they're using all kinds of really healthy foods, and they end up then teaching their parents how to cook healthy. And that, in my world, that's called reciprocal determinism. Usually you think it's the parent that's teaching the child, but the child is always teaching the parent, or maybe persuading the parent might be a better way to think about that. We actually don't see such pushback for kids trying these types of foods. It's about their parents and bringing that along. And what we've found is that building the skills of things like how you handle the food, how you handle that chicken that you can purchase, it's really building those skills. Those are called food management skills, and the combination of access to good healthy food plus actually teaching those skills makes a really big difference. There was a great study in Head Start to show that that worked. What we find, secondly, for WIC, for our families actually are sort of caught in this interesting place. They're not sure if they're still eligible as their children get older, because eligibility changes and it's not necessarily transparent for people to understand how the rules have changed and if they're still eligible. We have a project ongoing in our clinic at the Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt right now on that. And we find that also the other element is the stores that offer the food where you're using WIC or SNAP, and ensuring that business owners make it really easy and that they're incentivized to provide all those foods. It's the interaction at that point that also has made a big difference for our patients. So that's two elements. Is there a third question?
No, just if there were any studies or information that's out there to track, to look at the link between obesity and the supplemental programs.
Great. Perfect. Yes. And in fact, there's something called the Lancet report, which I'm sure you're going to be including. And it shows you that WIC, especially during the preschool period, that's one of the only successful interventions that has slowed down preschool obesity rates. So it's a pretty powerful study. Thank you.
Mayor Vickers, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you for the presentation. I was struck by the significance of early adoption of physical activity with our preteens. And obviously one vehicle for that are schools. But it seems like that we're not incentivizing them to do these things. Their incentives appear to be more toward achieving acceptable test scores as opposed to some of the life skills we're talking about. And so I'm so old that we had gym or phys ed every day, and classes were taught in home economics where people learned to cook and they learned about nutrition and the life skills that you're saying we should be encouraging people to adopt. So how do we incentivize our education system to focus on some of these important life skills so that we have a healthier population, particularly the importance of tackling this issue with our youngest citizens?
Thank you. I think implicit in your question is the answer that when you look at what are the critical skills that we are teaching people in school, and what are the skills that will lead them to success, economic success, and part of economic success is good health. So I have these conversations with my children as well. How important is calculus to me every day? And for me, it is still important because I'm in medicine, versus something like statistics, where you have to understand rates and prevalence and things that you're using all the time. What are the core skills that we should be learning? So that's one question, and I believe, just as I believe is implicit in your question, Mayor, is that learning how to cook and also enjoying and learning how to be physically active. Those are critical life skills that will improve not only your health, but your economic earning potential. I also think that to incentivize schools to do this means that there has to be, people usually respond to what's being measured and what determines if they are doing a good job. So we have to assess whatever we measure matters. That's where people spend their time. So instead of just focusing on measuring something like an outcome like body mass index, which, as you heard Dr. Van Zandt mentioned, is the result of many things together, if instead we're incentivizing that you have 30 minutes of physical activity every day is what you need, not once a week, every day. If that's actually incentivized, people will find a way to do it, but they can't be penalized for all the other things that are on their plate too. So it has to be a composite agreement about what we value and what we want to prioritize. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions for our presenter? Thank you very much for a very fact-filled and thoughtful report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much for
you,
the
members.
opportunity.
All right, I'll call your attention to tab 5, the effect of the COVID-19 recession on public infrastructure needs. The draft staff report for our review and comment. And I present to you Dr. Mark McIndoe, excuse me, our research director. Dr. McIndoe, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. I'm Mark McIndoe, TACIR research director. I'm presenting an interim staff report on the potential effects of socio and economic disruptions on public infrastructure needs. I'm placing that before you for your review and comment, and it's found under tab 5. Beginning in early 2020, the world was faced with unprecedented challenges triggered by the spread of COVID-19 and the resulting pandemic. Among many uncertainties stemming from the pandemic is whether it has affected the public infrastructure needs of communities in Tennessee. To help address this question, TACIR staff is conducting a two-part analysis of data from the Public Infrastructure Needs Inventory. For the purposes of the inventory, public infrastructure is defined as fixed capital assets valued at $50,000 or more and owned or controlled by state or local governments. However, school technology needs are also included for existing schools regardless of cost, because this information is not compiled on a statewide level by other organizations. We believe that analyzing reported infrastructure needs and funding data alongside other socioeconomic factors may help us better understand how economic conditions and disruptions like the Great Recession, as well as the recession caused by COVID-19, have affected public infrastructure needs. This report includes an analysis of infrastructure data from 2007 through 2019 and focuses primarily on the effects of the Great Recession, which establishes a baseline for our next report, which will focus on infrastructure needs data for 2020 and how needs may be affected by the social and economic disruptions of COVID. This report also includes feedback from a survey of local government officials, many of you participated, and interviews with state agencies to gauge the extent to which they anticipate the pandemic affecting infrastructure needs in their communities and organizations. This analysis of 2007 through 2019 data revealed that infrastructure needs reported did increase in conjunction with economic growth, But the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 did not cause any shift in changes in infrastructure needs in terms of dollar amount, project type, or project progression. Our finding that the Great Recession did not affect the dollar amount of reported public infrastructure needs is consistent with prior TACIR analysis, which found that population is the most significant factor that determines needs rather than funding-related factors that could be affected by economic downturns. Because project completion is connected with funding, we suspected that project completions might have been affected by the Great Recession. However, property taxes are one of the most significant sources of funding, and the amount of taxable property in a community does not necessarily decrease during an economic downturn, although tax collections may. Moreover, additional federal funding was made available to local governments following the Great Recession, which could have helped to offset decreases in revenue streams. As noted in TACIR's 2020 report, services provided by local governments and the sources of revenue to fund them, total revenue remained steady during and following the Great Recession. We also determined that the Great Recession and subsequent recovery did not cause any major shifts in the types of infrastructure needs reported. However, it may have contributed to the completion of projects in categories for which federal stimulus funds were directed, such as transportation projects. Next, we looked at project development. As projects progress, they move through 4 stages in the inventory: conceptual, planning and design, construction, and finally completion. Staff reviewed the overall rate that infrastructure needs move through these stages of development, but did not discover any correlation between project progress and changing economic conditions. Not surprisingly, one factor that does determine the progress from conceptual infrastructure need to a completed project is the availability of funding. We found that when infrastructure needs were fully funded from the conceptual stage, more than 50% of these were completed within 5 years. However, when infrastructure needs were not fully funded, most languished, with less than 12% of these being completed within 5 years. Most of the funding for public infrastructure projects comes from state and local governments, but the federal government has provided additional support for infrastructure in response to the pandemic through the CARES Act and other federal legislation. Despite some state and local revenue sources declining during the recession, which was caused by COVID-19, overall revenues remained strong. This was due in part to the passage of a series of public acts by the Tennessee General Assembly and new rules that the Tennessee Department of Revenue put in place before the pandemic. These actions facilitated the collection of revenue from certain online sales, resulting in more stable budgets for the state and many local governments, which may be a good sign for the ability to fund future public infrastructure needs. However, it is uncertain whether or to what extent public infrastructure needs will be affected by the socioeconomic disruptions caused by COVID, and we will present a more in-depth analysis next year. Thank you. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions and comments on this draft staff report.
One sort of comment on this. I mean, I'm not sure if this incorporates this, but for instance, in Nashville, we basically asked lots of boys and girls clubs to do, to do a different public function during the recession than they typically do. We used, several big public spaces like Bridgestone or the Titan Stadium parking lot for public testing. I mean, I'm not saying that those things are necessarily public infrastructure needs, but I'm curious as to if we're sort of capturing, what those things at the end of the day were vital public infrastructure for this community to get through the pandemic, and there's probably similar types of arrangements in other places. And I'm curious as to if we should incorporate some of those, get some feedback on what were the the way you made do, right? Because, I mean, you could imagine that there's probably some county who would, give a lot in order to relocate where they put their health department at this point, right? I mean, but there might be things that sort of shift how we think of some of this infrastructure and how it's deployed that it might be useful to capture in this. And I throw that out there just, for conversation at some level, Mr. Chairman.
I think you make a good point, and we did survey local government officials from November 2020 through the end of January 2021. Got a lot of insights, had the opportunity for a lot of open-ended comments, and one of the areas that we explicitly asked about was operational changes. And, it seems like there could be different definitions for infrastructure, whether it's physical infrastructure or human infrastructure, but what you're talking about seems to be an operational change that was facilitated by human healthcare related infrastructure, and we did see quite a bit of that. And the question remains after this initial report, which really just establishes a baseline. Obviously, the Great Recession was caused by a financial crisis, mainly in the housing market, and this COVID-induced pandemic caused by a public health crisis and the attempted response to that. So they're very different in nature, and so we're curious if the results on our communities may be different. Some of these operational changes may persist, telecommuting or remote learning, or not. And so initially, though, the survey that we got from local government officials did not show an immediate shift in new needs or different types of needs or bigger costs. Some projects did slow down because of supply chain issues or personnel. So I would encourage commission members to look at the survey that's included with this report and get a lot of insight into that. And we tried to structure this survey where we asked similar questions in a positive way and a negative way to kind of provide internal validation for the survey, and they seem to really get that and answer the same way, even though a question might be answered in the negative, affirmative.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just would say I would agree with everything Mark just said. I would add that I think that some of that contingency, how those contingency responses affected the need for infrastructure or how it allowed us to fill those gaps could be part of the discussion we already are planning on including in the second part of this report on how the but for. What if we hadn't received this large infusions of cash from higher levels of government? What would have the needs have dropped? So I think it's part of that kind of what if, what for discussion.
Thank you. Are there other questions? There being none, thank you very much for your presentation today.
Thank you.
I believe, members, that takes us, let's see. Oh, the good news is that I believe this takes us to the end of the program today. All right. And we will convene again tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. We'll see everybody's bright and shining faces at 8:30. All right. And then, without objection, then I will.
You may.
Yes, you may. Thank you. The great question from Kevin about, can we leave our books here? Yes, you may. But we will adjourn until 8:30 in the morning here. Thank you all very much. Great questions today and good debate.